This story began in the year 666 of our era. The great commander Yon-Gaesumun, who was called the god protector of Goguryeo, passed away. His death led to a great split throughout Goguryeo, and the state could no longer hold back the 100,000-strong army of the Tang dynasty. 2 years have passed since then, and now the last forces of Goguryeo found themselves driven into the Pyongyang fortress. The Tang army surrounded it, and for several days continued to publicly execute peasants to break the will of those hiding behind the fortress walls. But for the Tang warriors themselves, it was merely amusement. And so, to the scaffold they dragged another unfortunate peasant who kept begging for mercy, as if driven mad by fear. But his executioner only said with a cruel grin that he was born in the wrong country. However, just as the executioner was about to bring down the sword on his victim's neck, he was struck at that very moment by an enemy arrow. Everyone immediately turned toward the direction from which it flew, and saw a horseman on the hill. And in the next moment, a mounted squad rushed from that hill toward the Tang army. All its warriors and even the horses were clad in black armor, and the standard-bearers carried a scarlet banner with a 3-legged crow. At the sight of this war emblem, the Tang were horrified because their opponent was the ghost cavalry of Goguryeo. But then the captain angrily shouted at his soldiers and ordered them all to stop panicking. The fear of the enemy immediately changed to fear of their own captain. And then he declared that it was madness to think that the miserable 3,000 warriors of Goguryeo could withstand the 100,000-strong Tang army. And then the captain was the first to rush into attack and shouted on the run that the insignificant remnants of Goguryeo were no match for them. The commander of the ghost cavalry, whose name was Ko Chuncheon, rushed to meet him. But he was not just a commander, but the half-brother of the emperor himself and the great shaman of the entire Goguryeo army. Therefore, in the next moment, Chuncheon struck down the enemy captain with a single blow. At such a sight, the Tang warriors were horrified again. This became their fatal mistake, because Chuncheon did not stop and, bursting into the enemy ranks, beheaded 2 soldiers. And in the next moment, the entire ghost cavalry of Goguryeo joined the commander, and a fierce battle broke out between the 2 squads. However, despite the numerical advantage, the enemy began to quickly push back the Tang warriors. Meanwhile, part of the Goguryeo warriors freed the captured peasants, and soon Chuncheon pierced the last enemy with his spear. The Phantom Cavalry won this battle, but not the war. New Tang forces were already approaching from the rear. Then Chuncheon summoned the shaman of the Phantom Cavalry named Yon Huigaram and ordered him to escort the civilians to the Pyongyang fortress. Then the commander addressed his deputy, Buru, and his twin brother Uru, and ordered them to delay the pursuit. And Chuncheon himself would go at the vanguard to clear the way for the refugees. Armed with a second spear, the commander of the Phantom Cavalry fearlessly burst into the ranks of the enemy. The peasants rushed after with all their might, while Chuncheon, like a living storm, raced through the crowd of Tang warriors. Soon he managed to lead all the civilians through, while Buru distracted the enemy's attention. But suddenly one of the rescued peasants approached Chuncheon and respectfully asked the commander to allow him to fight. However, before Chuncheon could say a word, the son of that peasant interrupted the conversation. The boy looked fearlessly into the commander's eyes and declared that he would fight instead of his father. Chuncheon liked the brave youth, but in response he asked, "Does he know how to stay in the saddle?" The boy was confused by the question, and his face already revealed everything. Then Chuncheon told the youth that he could not fight and ordered to bring a horse for his father. The boy wanted to object, but his father put his hand on his shoulder and smiled, asking him to protect their mother and sister. And when the man mounted the horse, Chuncheon ordered the other peasants to run to the Pyongyang fortress. The peasants did as they were told, and meanwhile, from the opposite side, a huge Tang army was advancing on the Phantom Cavalry of Goguryeo. But Chuncheon calmly raised his spear and ordered his loyal warriors, "Do not let a single enemy escape." Soon the peasants reached the fortress gates and began desperately begging to be let in. They shouted and pleaded so loudly that their cries reached the ears of the last ruler of Goguryeo, Emperor Bojang. Clenching the armrest of the throne and grinding his teeth in despair, he turned to the captain of the guard and asked, "Is there really no way out?" In response, Daimodak knelt before him on one knee and reported that there were too many enemies. At these words, Bojang began to have a hysterical fit. First he laughed nervously, then bitterly cried. However, the captain of the guard calmly stated that His Majesty must flee the fortress before it was captured. But in response, the emperor said that he could not protect the state founded by King Tonmyeonsan, and even if he fled, where would he go? Then Daimodak revealed that he had prepared a ship on which His Majesty was to sail south, in order to then gather troops and launch a counterattack. But Bojang wearily leaned back on the throne's backrest and just as wearily asked, "Who will lead these troops?" Then in response, Daimodak loudly declared that it would be the great Sajako Chuncheon. At this name the emperor seemed to come to his senses and a spark of hope lit in his eyes. And then he looked at the captain of the guard and asked, will he fulfill his last request? Meanwhile, the ghostly cavalry of Goguryeo managed to deal with the first wave of enemies, but this victory was not without casualties. Chunshin glanced over the bodies of fallen comrades, and among them noticed the peasant who decided to fight alongside them. The commander held his gaze on him and said that the son would remember his valiant death. However, there was no time to mourn the fallen, for a new wave of Tang warriors was approaching. Brothers Buru and Uru argued among themselves who would kill more enemies, and the shaman Huigaram told his commander that the outcome of the battle was already decided. Chunshin knew this, and yet informed his warriors that they would not break through further. Then Buru suggested competing to see who would send more enemies to the afterlife, and the loser would go pull the beard of the greatest Yama himself. Such a proposal amused Chunshin, and he gladly agreed to it. And in the next moment, the commander laughed loudly, and the entire ghostly cavalry laughed with him. But as soon as the laughter subsided, Chunchon's face immediately changed, and he declared that not a single Tang creature would set foot in the Pyongyang fortress. However, in the next moment, its gates suddenly opened, and a rider came out. It was a messenger of the emperor himself who announced his order, to retreat to the port and wait there for further instructions. Such an order struck Chunshin, but he had no right to disobey it. Therefore, the ghostly cavalry of Goguryeo left the Pyongyang fortress and headed to the port, as was commanded. However, the strange order of the emperor continued to trouble the warriors. Then Huigaram suggested that the emperor intended to sail south and regroup there. But suddenly a courier caught up with the column of riders and reported that about 500 Tang warriors were pursuing a cart that had left the fortress. Huigaram had decided that one of the nobles was fleeing, but the messenger declared that the emperor's flag was flying over the carriage. Meanwhile, the situation for the fugitives was very dire. The enemies were quickly catching up to them. Captain Daimodok ordered the guard to stay close to the carriage and not let a single arrow pass. But suddenly the vice-captain turned his horse and ordered the others to keep moving forward while he bought them time. Daimodok wanted to stop him, but the vice-captain refused to listen and ordered 10 horsemen to follow him. It was pure suicide. But the vice-captain shouted to his comrades with a smile that they must protect His Highness the Air Prince. Unfortunately, the enemy commander struck first and struck down the vice-captain with a spear. Soon the Tansky warriors dealt with the 10 horsemen and resumed the chase. However, the vice-captain's sacrifice was not in vain, because in the next moment an arrow struck down the enemy commander. And when Daimodok turned around, he saw ghost cavalry horsemen approaching in the distance. At the sight of them, the captain of the guard could barely hold back tears. Soon the horsemen circled around the emperor's carriage and rushed to meet the pursuers. And after the captain's greeting, Chunchon ordered his warriors to destroy all enemies and not let a single one escape. And then 2 squads clashed in a fierce battle, but the Tang warriors had no chance. Uru was an archer of the ghost cavalry and was famous not only for his accuracy, but also for the ability to kill 2 enemies with 1 arrow. But his twin brother Buru was famous for his extraordinary strength. With 1 swing of his axe, he could cut a man in half. But while the Goguryeo warriors were finishing off the enemy, Chunchon asked Daimodok, "Is His Majesty in the carriage?" However, in response, the captain of the guard lowered his gaze with a sense of guilt and confessed that His Highness the Crown Prince was in the carriage. And then he voiced the emperor's last order, to put the young heir on a ship and deliver him to a safe place. Thus the ghost cavalry of Goguryeo took upon themselves the execution of their lord's last will. And at dawn the next day, a port appeared in the distance. However, the next moment scouts ran up to Chunchon and reported that the enemy had tracked them. Without hesitation, the commander ordered the horsemen to follow him, and told the other warriors to protect the air. The horsemen of the ghost cavalry formed a wall, and then Chunchon ordered to open fire immediately. And in the next moment, a rain of arrows fell upon the enemy squad. However, this was only a small part of the Tang army. The main forces were observing the battle from a safe distance from the arrows, and they were led by the supreme commander of the Tang Empire himself, Wei Chunhyun. Meanwhile, the carriage with the crown prince continued its journey to the port. But approaching the shore, scouts warned that Tang troops were already on the coast. They encountered a small detachment left by Captain Daimodok to protect the ship. They were commanded by a swordsman named Mount Querion, who gave the order to stand to the death until the crown prince was on the ship. And when the Tang warriors launched a frontal attack, he was the first to rush to meet them. Meanwhile, the supreme commander of the Tang Empire decided to meet the commander of the Phantom Cavalry face to face. Chunhyun offered Chunchon a deal. If the Phantom Cavalry surrendered, he would personally ask His Imperial Majesty to grant them the honor of fighting for the Tang Empire. In response, Chunchon said nothing, only nodded, causing the supreme commander to laugh loudly and say that it was a wise choice. However, when Chunhyun offered Chunchon the roll of his right hand, at that very second an arrow pierced his eyes. She let Uru in, who irritably asked his brother, could it be that the Tang soldiers only fight with words? Meanwhile, Those very Tang soldiers were shocked by the death of their commander-in-chief. Jinchon gave an order to Huiguram, and in the next moment a hail of battle axes rushed towards the enemies. By noon, the battle on the coast ended with the victory of the Goguryeo warriors, and soon Querion noticed the approach of the great Saja with the phantom cavalry. Only the Tang army was still pursuing them, so Jinchon immediately ordered to set sail. And so the phantom cavalry left their native shores and headed south. Having made sure that the enemy no longer pursued them, Jinchon decided to personally check the condition of the crown prince. He also wanted to find out what name was given to the young emperor and where his majesty was. To the first question, Demudok told that his majesty named the prince Ilchi, but to the second question the captain lacked the courage to answer. Instead, he handed Jinchon a letter and explained that it was from his majesty. Jinchon handed the infant to a maid and took the letter, in which the last order of the emperor to his younger brother was written. The last wish of Emperor Bojan was that Jinchon take the child and sail away with him towards a peaceful life. However, after reading the letter, Jinchon crumpled it in his hands with anger, for he had no right to call the emperor brother, and now he calls him brother. Then the commander of the phantom cavalry asked Daimudok about the fate of the Pyongyang fortress. But in response, the captain of the guard suddenly fell to his knees before him and began to beg for death. Such behavior shocked Jinchon, because it could mean only one thing. The Pyongyang fortress had fallen. And to confirm this, Jinchon saw thick smoke rising in the distance. The fortress was burning along with all the inhabitants, whom the commander of the phantom cavalry, to his sorrow, could not protect. However, Jinchon had no time to mourn the dead, for a terrible storm suddenly attacked the Goguryeo fleet. The waves were so fierce and huge that they sank one of the ships. Then the captain of the ship, scared half to death, rushed to the bridge and shouted that the ship needed to be turned around. He had spent his whole life at sea, but had never seen such terrible waves before. And suddenly, right in front of the fleet, a huge wall of water rose, terrifying the ship's crew. However, despite this, the crown prince in Jinchon's hands was happy and laughed loudly. The commander of the phantom cavalry took it as a sign from above and told his warriors that they had no way back. And then Jinchon drew his sword and ordered to break through the waves, for it was the will of Crown Prince Ilchi, and the last battle of the Goguryeo fleet. No one on the ship dared to disobey the order, and in the next moment the ships crashed straight into the water wall. And then the world was engulfed in a dazzling light and everything fell silent. Jinchon came to consciousness on the ship's deck, holding tightly the faithful sword and the infant. Fortunately, the crown prince was unharmed and even in a joyful mood. But the ship's captain was in complete shock and bewilderment at what he saw before his eyes. Right in front of the fleet was land with a dense forest, but the nearest mainland was still very far away. But Buru saw no problem in this, so he carelessly ordered to dock at the shore. But in response, the captain advised him to look around, and then Buru realized that they were not at sea, but in the middle of a lake surrounded by land. From this discovery, Buru almost strangled the captain, deciding that he had been leading them in circles on the lake for several days. But Huiguram asked his friend to calm down, and explained that the captain was clearly not to blame for what was happening. Then the shaman addressed Jinchon and asked, what should they do next? In response, the great Saja declared that they were now far from their homeland in any case, which means the fleet is safe here. Then Huiguram ordered the captain to begin the landing, and he was only glad to leave the ship as soon as possible. Soon the warriors of Goguryeo landed on the shore and quickly built a camp. And the first order of Jinchon on the new land was to scout the surroundings, which the commander entrusted to the brothers Buru and Uru, and Huiguram was entrusted by the great Saja to arrange guards around the perimeter of the camp. Then Jinchon addressed the captain of the guard Daimudoku and ordered him to report the number of survivors. Well, after the report, everyone engaged in performing their direct duties. Everyone except Jinchon, who remained standing at the entrance to the tent. It was then that he heard the crown prince suddenly roar. Jinchon immediately entered the tent and saw how the maidservants were trying in every way to calm the infant. But noticing the great Saja, all three maidens instantly bowed and addressed him as his highness. However, Jinchon demanded that they no longer call him that. Then one of the maids apologized and explained that it was time to change the heir prince's diaper, so they needed to be alone. But the commander of the phantom cavalry was not going anywhere, and made the maids understand that he would not take his eyes off the baby. They had no choice but to change the prince's diapers under the watchful eye of the great Saja. But when the maid removed the diapers from the baby, Jinchon immediately ordered to call the captain of the guard at once. Meanwhile, Buru and Uru with a small detachment were combing the forest in search of game. But the reconnaissance brought no results, which made the frustrated and hungry Buru say that they would be very lucky if they found at least one boar here. However, Uru disagreed with his brother, because in this forest you would not find even an ant, let alone a boar. But suddenly, very close by, there was the crackling of breaking branches and the rustling of leaves. The brothers immediately grabbed their weapons and ordered the other warriors to be on alert. And the noise kept increasing, which made Buru happily think that tonight they would definitely have the meat of a huge wild boar for dinner. But how surprised the Goguryeo warriors were when from behind the bushes appeared anyone but clearly not a beast and not even a human. 4 mysterious creatures approached the detachment, who looked like people but had pig snouts instead of faces. Uru ordered everyone not to take their eyes off the aliens and suggested that in these lands, boars walk on 2 legs. But then Buru asked his brother, if these are really boars, why do they have green skin? For Uru, the question was very stupid, so he irritably explained the obvious to his brother. These boars are simply sick. And then a heated argument broke out between the brothers, which only increased their appetite. Therefore, Buru and Uru agreed that it does not matter whether these boars walk on 2 legs or have green skin. The main thing is that they taste like wild boar meat. And in the next moment, the brothers eagerly and with anticipation pounced on their strange prey. Meanwhile, Captain Daimodok rushed to the tent of the Great Saja. But there he was met with a shocking sight. The commander of the Phantom Cavalry held a sword to the throat of an unfortunate maid. Noticing the captain's arrival, Jinchon told him that the child was switched, but none of the maids could explain it. Then Daimodok knelt again and presented another letter from His Majesty. Jinchon accepted the letter. And then the captain of the guard explained that the emperor ordered it to be delivered when the Goguryeo fleet was safe. The letter stated that Yilchi is not the crown prince, but the daughter of Captain Yol Ryuhwan, who remained to defend the Pyongyang fortress and His Majesty. Emperor Bojin thought that the life of this girl would be too short, so he sent her to Jinchon. For this deception, the emperor asked for forgiveness, but there was no other way. Otherwise, Jinchon, without hesitation, would have sacrificed himself for the country. Although imperial blood flowed in him, Bojin did not want to condemn his younger brother to even greater suffering, since he had already spent his whole life on the battlefield. At farewell, the emperor asked Jinchon not to blame himself for not being able to protect the country, but to live differently, listening to his heart. And Bojin also very much hoped that when the girl grew up, she would become a faithful companion to his younger brother. With this, the emperor's farewell letter ended, and Jinchon quietly said that His Majesty had granted him freedom. And the emperor also gave him hope, which now joyfully reached out to him in tiny hands. Jinchon turned away to hide his embarrassment from everyone and ordered the maid to change the child's diapers. Then he approached Daimodok and asked about the infant's mother, to which the captain of the guard said that she stayed to defend the fortress together with her husband. After that, Jinchon silently left the tent and looking at the clear sky wondered, what should he do now? For the first time, he took a sword in his hands at 6 years old, and at 16 he was already on the battlefield. When enemies invaded the homeland, Jinchon fought on the front line. His duty, as an illegitimate offspring of imperial blood, was to protect the Goguryeo Empire. But now everything had lost meaning, and Jinchon no longer knew. For what purpose should he unsheath his sword? When it got dark and Buru and Uru returned from reconnaissance, Jinchon convened a meeting. The brothers reported that they had scouted the forests but found no enemies. Also, the local forest did not resemble the forests of the Goguryeo Empire, and some trees looked different. But the strangest discovery was the green boars that walked on 2 legs like humans. However, before Buru could finish his report, a worried sentry suddenly burst into the tent. Daimodok immediately reprimanded the guard for making noise during the council, and asked about the cause of the commotion. But in response, the sentry, stammering with fear, said that it seemed the heavens were angry. Everyone went outside the tent, and then the sentry pointed to the night sky. There, the Goguryeo warriors saw 3 celestial discs, as if the moon had given birth to 2 daughters. But besides that, Huigurum noticed that the stars in the sky were completely different, as if it were a completely different world. However, in response to this discovery, Jinchon concluded that at least for now, they could all stop worrying about the Tang army. The next day, Buru and Uru decided to cook the meat of a strange wild boar they had managed to catch. Only the brothers did not suspect that the creature they were about to slaughter like a pig was actually an orc. The snouted native tried to explain to his tormentors that he was not an animal, but the brothers did not understand his speech. Buru thought the boar was trying to say something, but Uru asked his brother, where had he ever seen talking boars? However, the next moment the brothers were stopped by the arriving Jinchon with Huiguram, and when Buru asked for the reason, the commander explained that since the boar was green, it might be sick. But then one of the sentries rushed to the group, shouting about a big problem while running. Buru asked irritably, what now? Could it be that a 2-legged bull had appeared? However, the answer surprised everyone present, because the sentry asked in astonishment, how did he know that? And the next moment, that very 2-legged bull rammed one of the erected walls. This creature was called a minotaur, but for the ghostly Goguryeo cavalry, it was just another enemy. The warriors met it with a wall of shields, but the Minotaur smashed its axe onto it and sent 2 soldiers flying. Then the warriors responded with a volley of battle axes. However, despite multiple wounds, the Minotaur stood firm on its feet. But not for long, because in the next moment boarding hooks clamped onto its horns. It was the brothers Buru and Uru who lassoed the Minotaur, and with all their extraordinary strength pulled it back. And when the Minotaur fell to its knees, Uru ordered his archers to pepper it with arrows. And finally Buru finished off the beast by beheading it with a single blow. With a satisfied look, slinging the axe over his shoulder, Buru asked his brother, "Can we then eat this bull?" In response, Uru declared that now the great Saja certainly would not forbid it. However, in the next moment the brothers discovered that the Minotaur was not alone. 3 more of its kind ran out of the forest. And even more, following the Minotaurs ran 4 kobolds. However, the brothers did not lose their composure and immediately rushed to meet the new opponents. The first Minotaur brought down an axe on Buru, but he simply blocked the blow. Then the second Minotaur came in from the side, intending to cut Buru in half. But in the next moment, Jinchon entered the fight, cutting off the Minotaur's paw. Meanwhile, Buru dealt with his opponent, splitting him from nose to tail. And Uru finished off the second Minotaur with a precise shot to the forehead. But when the dust settled, Jinchon noticed that he felt much lighter than before. Then Huigaram explained to the commander that in this world the gravity is weak, so armor, weapons, and the body feel lighter than usual. However, the instructive lecture was interrupted by a wounded Minotaur who intended to take revenge on Jinchon. This became his fatal mistake. In the blink of an eye, the commander of the Phantom Cavalry cut the Minotaur into pieces. And sheathing his sword, Jinchon admitted with regret that the Tang warriors were no match for him now. But if he had such strength in his homeland, the Goguryeo Empire would not have fallen. Meanwhile, the spearmen finished off 2 kobolds, and the remaining 3 fled. Jinchon ordered Buru to catch and destroy the fugitives, and also to scout as much territory as possible. And at that time, a blond man was rushing through the forest, leading a girl behind him. The man was a resident of this world, and his name was Veron, and the girl was his niece named Sarah. Veron ordered her to run further while he delayed their pursuer, who was a huge ogre. Veron shot at him with a bow, but the arrow bounced off the thick hide like off a stone. And in the next moment, Sarah suddenly tripped over a stone and fell to the ground. The ogre immediately aimed at the helpless girl, ignoring Veron's desperate shots. However, when the monster had already stretched out its paw towards its victim, someone swiftly grabbed the girl and took her away from danger. And when Sarah opened her eyes, she saw before her a stocky and very attractive man with a beard, which made her mistake him for a dwarf. Only Buru had no idea what a dwarf was, nor did he understand what language the girl was speaking at all. But there was no time for introductions. The ogre was already looming over Buru and raised his arm for a crushing attack. And in the next moment, the ogre slammed his fists with such monstrous force that the ground cracked. But by that time, Buru and Sarah were no longer in the same place. The deputy commander instantly moved to a safe distance and set the girl down on the ground. And then Buru fearlessly rushed towards the ogre. Stunned Veron ran up to his niece, still not believing what was happening. Because how could an ordinary person stand alone against such a monster? However, in the next moment, Buru split the ogre in half with one blow. After such a spectacle, Veron and Sarah immediately fell to their knees and began to thank Mother Earth for sending them a mighty warrior to help. Only Buru had no idea what they were doing or what they were even talking about. Therefore, the deputy commander led the rescued peasants to the camp to question them about these lands. As expected, soldiers gathered at the entrance to the tent, curiously examining the foreign guests. Sarah became nervous under their scrutinizing gazes, but Veron swore to his niece that he would protect her no matter what happened. However, in response, the girl admitted that she had badly bruised her knee, so at least Veron should escape to warn the villagers. Veron was stunned by such a proposal and indignantly asked, how could he abandon his niece and run away? But before the girls could answer, Buru entered the tent and strictly ordered them to stop their chatter. And the soldiers behind him began to ask, why do the strangers have such pale skin and golden hair, and are all the local girls so beautiful? Sarah did not understand their language, but guessed that this was a punitive squad from the kingdom of Haiyan. But Veron doubted this, because there were no soldiers with black hair and dark eyes in the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, Buru noticed that the girl was clearly uncomfortable with such excessive attention, so he ordered the soldiers to leave. They did not risk incurring the deputy's wrath and quickly scattered. However, soon the tent was visited by the great Saja himself in the company of Huigaram. Jinchon asked the guests, do they understand them? However, Veron and Sarah remained silent, and then Buru admitted that he could not understand anything they were saying. Ignorance could cost the Goguryeo warriors their lives. They did not even know where they were, or who lived there, besides the walking boars and bulls. Therefore, It was vital to obtain information from the natives, and for that, it was necessary to master their language. But suddenly Uru declared that he had an idea, or rather, he had an assistant who knew all the languages of the world. This person turned out to be the swordsman Mount Kvaerion. Jinchon was surprised by such a candidate, but Uru assured that Kvaerion traded in the West with his merchant parents, thanks to which he learned all foreign languages. Jinchon decided to trust Uru's decision and ordered Kvaerion to try to talk to the locals. For Kvaerion himself, it was a chance to prove his worth, because there was no place he hadn't been, and no language he didn't know. And so he confidently approached Sarah and with a friendly smile said to her, "Buongiorno." However, in response, the girl only became more confused, and an awkward silence settled in the tent. Then Kvaerion waved to Sarah and said, "Hello," but the result was the same. And judging by the commander's expression, Kvaerion guessed that he was already beginning to lose patience. Then Kvaerion decided to try a welcoming kiss on the cheek, as the French do. However, Buru categorically did not like this idea, which made him angrily ask, "What the hell is he doing?" Kvaerion realized that his time and the patience of the great Saji were running out, so he began desperately listing all the foreign greetings he knew. This continued until Uru corrected the cerebellum of the hapless polyglot and then apologized to the commander for the whole circus. In response, Jinchon said disappointedly that he had already forgotten that outside of battle, Kvaerion was useless. And Buru asked his brother, what was he thinking, introducing this swindler and upstart to everyone? But Uru said nothing in response, only silently dragged Kvaerion by the scruff. And when they both left the tent, Huigaram asked for permission to speak with the girl, to which Jinchon did not object. Then the shaman of the Phantom Cavalry knelt before Sarah and, pointing to himself with a finger, pronounced his name syllable by syllable. It was then that Sarah understood that the man before her had introduced himself. Then Huigaram pointed to the girl with his hand and asked her name. And then in response, Sarah also introduced herself. Finally learning the name of the beauty, the soldiers rejoiced together. But perhaps the happiest of all was Buru. He also proudly declared that Sarah had learned his name before Huigaram's. Only the deputy did not realize that in the local language the word Buru means gratitude, not his name. One way or another, Jinchon decided to end the acquaintance for today, and soon left the tent along with the other officers. Sarah and Veron were left alone, but her uncle was somewhat upset by the fact that everyone simply forgot about him. Night soon fell, but not only over the camp of the Goguryeo Empire. Besides them, a camp of the Kingdom of Haiyan was established in these lands. Baron Elven managed this camp, who at the moment was occupied with his dinner. Behind him, like a shadow, stood Sir Hoikelum Tilumen, who commanded the Baron's knights. But suddenly a scout entered the tent and reported that mercenaries would soon capture the farmer's settlement. In response, the Baron grimaced with anger and hissed that since these parasites fled from the kingdom, he would make them regret it. The next morning for Jinchon began, as usual, with listening to a report from Huigaram over breakfast. The great Saja inquired when the guests would leave their camp, to which Huigaram replied, "Today," and then added that Sarah got along well with Buru and Uru, so they were appointed as her escorts. Then in response, Jinchon snorted and said that cleanliness and simplicity always go hand in hand. However, no sooner had he said this than in the next moment those very cleanliness and simplicity entered the tent, in the person of Sarah and Buru. Jinchon ordered his deputy to go to the village to inform the residents that the Goguryeo warriors helped Sarah and her uncle. In response, Buru, clearly in high spirits, declared that the great Saja could rely on him. However, Jinchon added that Captain of the Guard, Daimudok, would also go with him. Buru became worried from such news and still dared to ask the commander, does he really not trust him? Then Jinchon had to explain that he had not stopped trusting his deputy, but Buru must focus on Sarah's safety in order to make a good impression. Uru will not be able to help his brother because he will guard Veron, so the captain of the guard will go with Buru. Now Buru understood everything and loudly laughed throughout the tent. Meanwhile, Jinchon mentally added that he still only trusts his deputy in battle. However, it soon became clear that Daimudok was overwhelmed with work, so Jinchon had no choice but to send the brothers without the captain's supervision. And now a small detachment under the command of Buru and Uru was heading to the farmer's village. The brothers even took captive orcs with them so that they would pull the cart with supplies for the locals as a gesture of goodwill. Soon the scout reported that he noticed a settlement ahead. Then Uru stopped the column and ordered Kvaerion to clarify with Veron, "Is this the village?" The swordsman conveyed Veron's words, and in response, he warned that the residents might be frightened by the armed detachment, so he and Sarah would go first and explain everything. The brothers did not object, and soon Veron with his niece reached the walls of their native settlement. However, Veron noticed that the village was too quiet, and all the inhabitants seemed to have disappeared somewhere. But then Sarah saw some kind of crowd on the main square. However, the next moment Veron covered her mouth and dragged her around the corner of the nearest house. Then he told his niece to be quiet, and he cautiously peeked out from behind the cover. Before Varan opened a frightening scene, armed mercenaries had driven all the villagers to the main square. The elder addressed the mercenary leader, whose name was Murin, and asked, "Why are they doing this?" In exchange for food and money, the mercenaries promised to stop the orc horde, but Murin said with a cruel smile that they would not risk their lives fighting the orcs. Then the mercenary leader pressed a knife to the elder's neck and added that instead they could easily earn money simply by capturing all the peasants. And the next moment, Murin ordered to kill everyone who was of no value. And at that very second, the mercenaries began beating the captured men and old men. The elder tried to rush to their aid, but Murin pinned him to the ground with his boot. And then the mercenary leader asked, "Is being eaten by orcs better than living as a slave?" The elder did not answer, but in his thoughts admitted that he had made a mistake by trusting strangers so easily. And he also prayed that Varan and Sarah would not return to the village, because at least these two had to be saved. Meanwhile, Varan ordered his niece to run back quickly and inform their new friends about what was happening. Then Sarah asked her uncle what he was going to do, to which Varan honestly admitted that he intended to buy as much time as he could. However, the next moment behind his back, Sarah saw a tall shadow with horror. The mercenary beat Varan and dragged him along with Sarah right to the feet of the leader. As a reward for the successful find, Murin allowed him to be the first to have fun with the girl. Varan desperately tried to protect his niece but got kicked in the face, and then the mercenary dragged the resisting Sarah to a secluded place. However, the next moment a battle axe plunged into the scoundrel's skull and the mercenary crashed to the ground with a thud. Then both the mercenaries and the peasants saw a dwarf riding at full gallop. But Buru did not care about all their looks. He rushed through the crowd straight to Sarah. And then he dismounted and, kneeling before the girl, ordered her to take Verona away from here. Sarah helped her uncle to stand up, and none of the mercenaries dared to stop them from leaving. And only when Sarah and Verona had safely departed did Buru loudly give the command, "To battle." And in the next moment, the riders of the Phantom Cavalry burst into the village. And then the deputy of the Great Saja gave his warriors the final instruction: "Spare no one who is armed." Obeying the will of their commander, the Koguryo riders engaged the mercenaries in battle, but the latter had no chance. Defeat was a matter of time, and realizing this, Murin quickly mounted his horse. His lieutenant suggested that this kingdom had sent a knightly order, but Murin stated that the punitive squad could not have arrived here so quickly. Moreover, the mercenary leader had never heard of such a knightly order either in the kingdom or on the entire continent. But suddenly the mercenaries who had mounted horses began to fall dead one after another. They were all struck down by enemy arrows, which made Murin decide that there were crossbowmen among their opponents. But how surprised he was when a detachment of ordinary archers rode into the village. For Murin, this was the last straw. He ordered his men to retreat and was the first to flee. But Buru noticed his escape and immediately gave chase. Then Murin ordered 3 riders to finish off the shorty. This was a huge mistake, because more than anything Buru hated being called shorty. For this, he knocked 2 mercenaries out of their saddles with one blow, and the third, Buru split in half along with his horse. At such a sight, Murin was horrified and ordered the remaining mercenaries to stop the dwarf at any cost. But Buru no longer pursued the fugitives. Throwing his axe over his shoulder, he acknowledged the mercenaries, for they fled skillfully. Then Buru ordered his warriors to deal with the remaining opponents, and at that very moment, riders of the Ghost Cavalry rushed towards the mercenaries. But then a lieutenant approached Buru and asked what to do with the escaped leader. However, Buru smirked and told him not to waste time on the coward, because Uru was already dealing with him. Meanwhile, Murin, sparing no horse, rushed to Baron Elvin's camp to report what had happened. However, in the next moment, 2 arrows pierced the mercenary's back, causing him to tumble off the horse. But even after that, Murin was still alive. Only not for long, because Uru had already drawn the next arrow on the bowstring. And when the mercenary leader was finished off, Uru ordered his warriors to return back. Meanwhile, mourning settled over the village. The peasants were grieving their killed husbands, sons, and fathers. Watching their sorrow with sympathy, Uru quietly said that the wildest creature of all is man. But then the village elder knelt before him and began to plead for mercy. Fortunately, Veron hurried to calm the residents and explained to them that these warriors had come to help them. The peasants could not believe his words, for they thought these were soldiers from the punitive detachment of the kingdom of Haiyan. Then Buru called Kverion to himself and ordered him to find a translator to accurately convey his words to the peasants. Meanwhile, Uru with his keen gaze noticed some movement in the forest thicket, so he declared that negotiations would have to wait. Buru immediately approached his brother and asked, what did he see? However, Uru did not have to answer, because in the next moment a whole horde of orcs appeared from behind the trees. But Buru did not lose his composure and at the same second sent a messenger to warn the Great Saja. Then he turned again to Kverion and ordered him to gather all the peasants who were able to hold a bow. Soon the order was carried out and Varan was appointed at the head of the new squad of archers. However, Uru assigned Kverion to him and ordered everyone to shoot only on his signal. Then Uru asked his warriors about the number of remaining arrows and, as it turned out, most had from 5 to 7 pieces. Meanwhile, the horde of orcs had already left the forest and rushed straight to the village gates. However, there they were already awaited by a wall of archers from Koguryo. And they were led by Uru, who loudly shouted to the archers, "If each of their shots does not kill at least 2, they will all perish here." And in the next moment he gave the signal and the archers, all as one, let loose arrows at the orcs. They struck the enemies with such swift speed that the peasants watching the battle did not even see them. And right after the archers, Buru entered the battle, leading the horsemen behind him. By that moment the breathless messenger had already reached the camp. But while Jinchon was only listening to his report, Buru with the horsemen were thinning the ranks of the orcs. The warriors of Goguryeo did not charge headlong, but attacked with raids. And when the horsemen retreated, their withdrawal was covered by archers. And soon this tactic turned the orcs to flight. Buru ordered the horsemen to drive them into the forest. However, in the next moment someone blocked the orcs' path. And then from the forest darkness came an orc who was much larger than his comrades. It was their leader, Muqabal, who as a warning beheaded one of the deserters, and then growled that he would tear to pieces anyone who retreated before the humans. The orcs collectively froze, for fear of the leader outweighed fear of the Goguryeo warriors. And then Muqabal raised his battle axe and declared that as long as he was here, victory would be with the orcs. His battle cry inspired the orcs and awakened in them a thirst for blood. Then the leader ordered them to split into 4 squads and resume the attack on the village. Buru underestimated the enemy. He did not expect that among the orcs there would be a commander familiar with battle tactics. Therefore he immediately led the horsemen back to the village. At that time the orcs had already begun climbing over its wall. One of the peasants managed to impale an orc on a spear, but the orcs possessed extraordinary resilience. For his bravery, the peasant paid with his hand. However, in the next moment an arrow pierced the orc's forehead. It was Uru who hurried to help the peasant. But following one orc, 3 more appeared. Uru finished off one of them with a precise axe throw, and then ordered the wounded peasant to raise his spear. Through the pain, the man did as he was told, and behind Uru, 2 more spearmen joined. But suddenly Uru heard a woman scream. The orcs had already penetrated deep into the village and attacked the peasants. Fortunately, Buru and his axe arrived just in time to help. Both brothers engaged the orcs in battle, but the situation was dire. 200 dead were no place, and 4 more came from the forest. The brothers understood that at this pace they were unlikely to hold out until reinforcements arrived. However, they had no other choice, for fleeing from boars was unworthy of a warrior from Goguryeo. Therefore the brothers, Buru and Uru, accepted their last battle with smiles. But suddenly, a huge cloud of dust appeared in the distance and the sound of hundreds of hooves was heard. And when the dust cleared, both orcs and humans saw the full power of the phantom cavalry led by Jinchon. The brothers were insanely happy to see the great Saja, for it meant their hunt for the boars would continue. Therefore, Querion and all the warriors of Goguryeo attacked the orcs with renewed strength. Meanwhile, Jinchon ordered his riders to form a wedge. The phantom cavalry rushed straight at the orc army, and Muqabal watched their approach from the heights. However, despite the reinforcements, the orc chieftain was confident in his strength, for he had devoted his entire life to studying human battle strategy. And therefore Muqabal loudly declared that it does not matter how skilled the riders are, because they will never break through the wall of brave orcs. The chieftain called his kin to gather together, and they all began to carry out his will en masse. Only no one among the humans expected that the orcs would literally form a living wall. Huiguram was forced to admit that they would not be able to ram through such a formation. Only Jinchon did not intend to attack the enemy head-on. At the very last moment he gave the command and the Goguryeo riders sharply flanked the orcs from both sides. Muqabal rejoiced, thinking that the human cavalry was fleeing from the indestructible wall of his orcs. But in reality, it was a diversionary maneuver to buy the archers time to prepare. And in the very next moment Uru ordered the archers to open fire. The clustered crowd of orcs became an easy target even for peasants. Struck by arrows, the orcs began to fall one after another, and soon their walls simply collapsed like a house of cards. And those orcs who escaped the arrows met the spears of the phantom cavalry. From this, Muqabal became furious and ordered the orcs to unite again into a wall. But the archers and horsemen did not allow them to do this. And in the next moment, a spear pierced Muqabal's chest. It was thrown by Jinchon, and now everyone watched as the orc leader fell dead from the sheer cliff. The orcs were horrified by such a sight. Meanwhile, Jinchon ordered the remaining enemies to be slaughtered. The Goguryeo horsemen began mercilessly carrying out the order. However, a few orcs still managed to escape into the forest. Nevertheless, the battle ended. and the peasants marked the victory with joyful shouts. Soon the great sage of Goguryeo visited the village for which his people risked their lives. The peasants met him warily, but the elder dared to be the first to greet his savior. Jinchon ordered a translator to be brought, and Uru immediately called Kaverion. And when the swordsman approached Jinchon, he ordered to tell the peasants that the phantom cavalry is leaving. Buru tried to persuade the commander, but Huigaram stopped his friend. Then the elder asked, "What will happen to the villagers if the warriors leave?" But in response, Jinchon calmly and harshly stated that the peasants must protect their own lives. As soon as Querion translated his words, all the villagers immediately fell to their knees and began to beg for protection. However, in response, the great Saja coldly asked, "Do they want to become slaves?" At this question, the peasants fell silent, and then Jinchon declared that the Goguryeo warriors live to protect their people and they will not shed blood to defend such weak-willed cowards. The peasants must defend their own territory, and money should be spent not on mercenaries, but on swords and armor, for lands protected by outsiders are doomed. And then the great Saja of Goguryeo drew his sword and swore that if the peasants take up arms, he will accept them as part of his people and family. However, in response, all the villagers remained silent. Then Jinchon turned his horse and said in farewell that he would return for an answer. But suddenly someone from the crowd shouted that they would take up the sword. And when Jinchon turned around, he saw a boy who, though with difficulty, still raised the sword of his fallen father. The brave youth reminded Jinchon of a boy from his native world who wanted to fight the invaders from the Tang Empire. This memory made the great sage dismount and approach the young man. Then he showed the boy how to properly hold the sword and said that since he had taken the blade in his hands, he must live to protect his family. But as soon as Jinchon spoke these words, all the other peasants took up their tools after the boy. Then Jinchon kept his word and led not only his warriors but all the peasants out of the village. Soon the village was filled with crows that flew down to feast on the carrion. However, besides the scavengers, a punitive squad led by Tiliman also arrived in the village. But all the royal knights could find were hastily abandoned houses and many corpses everywhere. The scout reported the disappearance of the farmers personally to Baron Elven, who was also accompanying the squad. The Baron asked Tiluman's opinion, to which the knight suggested that the orcs and mercenaries were killed by the same group. Then Elven asked, could it be that the farmers killed the orcs and mercenaries and then disappeared? But in response, Tiluman admitted that he had never before seen arrows with black fletching, and therefore assumed that an unknown force was involved here. However, for the Baron, this fact could mean only one thing. He had competitors who coveted not his property. And so Alvin ordered his knights to track down the strangers and exterminate them all. Meanwhile, the ghostly cavalry safely returned to the camp. But as soon as Jinchon dismounted, Captain Daimodok immediately approached him and asked, "Who are all these refugees?" In response, the great Saja explained that from now on these peasants are part of Goguryeo. From these words, Daimodok had already decided that Jinchon was finally going to continue the lineage of the great emperor here. But he assured that he recognized these people as his own only because Goguryeo needed new warriors for defense, as well as women and children for whom these warriors would fight. However, Daimodok was supported by Huigaram, who advised Jinchon to listen to the captain and continue his lineage. But the great Saja was very stubborn. Instead of answering, he suggested that Huigaram himself become emperor. At this, Captain Daimodok lost patience and reminded Jinchon that now was not the time for jokes. However, he calmly stated that he had spent his whole life in battles and therefore was not strong in state affairs. An inept ruler destroys his own people, so Jinchon will do only what is within his power, and Captain Daimodok and Huigaram will take on what is within their power. With that, Jinchon closed the topic, but the next moment some shouts came from the side. The culprits of the commotion turned out to be 3 bearded men, only very short in stature. Seeing them, Buru asked his brother if these were their relatives, but Uru declared it nonsense. Meanwhile, Captain Daimodok told Jinchon that this trio belonged to the dwarf people, and they called themselves the Stone Brothers. The dwarves were pursued by orcs, but fortunately they came across a patrol that quickly dealt with the pursuers. The warriors of Goguryeo immediately noticed the resemblance between the strangers and the generals Buru and Uru, so they decided to bring the dwarves to the camp. At that moment the great Saja was absent, so Captain Daimodok entrusted the trio to the care of Old Man Chan, who was the blacksmith of the Phantom Cavalry. And to his surprise, the guests immediately got to work and began managing the forge. The dwarves were very interested in studying the armor and weapons of the Phantom Cavalry, and the eldest of the trio discovered that the swords of the Goguryeo warriors had perfect balance and were forged from the purest iron without a single impurity. Soon the great Saja returned to the camp with the refugees, and then the dwarves saw the brothers Buru and Uru. The Trinity could not believe their eyes, for among their people there was a legend about the clan of Titans. Deciding that the twins were descendants of this legendary clan, the dwarves immediately fell prostrate before them. Not only the formidable Buru and Uru were thrown into confusion by this turn of events, but even the great Saja himself. When night fell on his camp, he decided to take a walk along the pier to clear his head and be alone with himself. Jinchon was a descendant of the great emperor, but as an illegitimate child, he spent half his life on the battlefield. The empire that Jinchon so desperately sought to protect burned down, and he could not even die alongside his comrades in arms. And that girl too. Although she was born in the imperial house, she cannot become an heir. Therefore, for her and all the warriors of Goguryeo, Jinchon must make a choice. If this is no longer their world, then continuing the history of the Goguryeo Empire will become his duty and the meaning of his life. With this thought, Jinchon smirked at the night sky and said that the die is cast. Within a month, he was patrolling the camp territory not as the Great Saja, but as the new Great Emperor. He was accompanied by all the senior officers, Daemodok, Huigaram, and Buru with Uru. On the road, the shaman told Jinchon that at first the refugees were afraid of the warriors, but in just 1 month they became close friends. The food problem was solved thanks to the seeds brought by the farmers. As for the dwarves, they turned out to be not only blacksmiths but also skilled builders, so the housing problem resolved itself. Moreover, the dwarves were so impressed by their ironworking techniques that they now help old Chan in the forge. However, there was bad news. In a few days the wedding was to take place, but there was a shortage of clothes, drinks, and meat. Fortunately, Veron advised Huigaram to sell the skins and bones of creatures in the city to earn some money. Captain Daemodok immediately volunteered to carry out this task. However, Huigaram reminded the captain that he already had enough concerns in the camp, so the shaman suggested going to the city instead of him. Only Huigaram did not expect that the great Saja would have a better idea. By noon, Jinchon, accompanied by Veron, Kverion, and Huigaram, reached the city walls. The shaman still could not resist asking, why this time did the great Saja decide to go on reconnaissance personally? Jinchon did not answer the question, but Huigaram already understood that his commander was simply curious to see the city. The group of 4 headed to the city gates, unaware that they had an observer. At the city entrance, the Jinchon squad was awaited by 2 guards. Entry was allowed only after checking documents and the cart with cargo, but Veron resolved this issue simply by bribing the guards. However, when the group of 4 had already entered the gates, one of the guards suddenly ordered Jinchon to stop. The great Saja had to comply, and then the guard brazenly tore the hood off his head. At the sight of the foreigner with black hair and yellowish skin, the guard immediately became wary. But fortunately, Veron came to the rescue, offering the guard an additional payment for blindness and silence. The guard accepted the bribe, but before letting the strangers pass, he mockingly struck Jinchon on the head with a spear. The great Saja endured this prank, but shortly after he asked Veron, what was the name of that guard? In response, Veron said that the guard's name was Irun Kalsuman, and then Jinchon swore that he would remember this name well. Meanwhile, Huigaram felt that someone was following them. Soon the squad reached their destination, which turned out to be the shop of a merchant known to Veron. He was extremely surprised by his friend's catch, since an ogre and 24 soldiers would not have managed it. However, Veron quickly changed the subject and asked if the merchant also needed ogre blood. In response, the shop owner explained that only mages buy it, and since there are none in the city, the merchant has no need for it. But the next moment, a gray-bearded mage burst into the shop and declared from the threshold that he would buy ogre blood. The merchant and Veron were both stunned by such a coincidence, while the mage jumped to the crate and began inspecting the goods. Soon the elder declared that the blood was of excellent quality, and he was ready to pay 1 gold and 50 silver for 3 vials. However, the merchant apologized to the mage and explained that such a price was impossible. Then the elder offered all the money he had, but only for 1 vial. But unfortunately, the merchant remained adamant. Then the mage discarded politeness and angrily declared that he, Rizel, is a genius mage born only once a century. However, the merchant was unimpressed by the mage's words. Moreover, he reminded him that nobles shower gold even on 3rd circle mages, so Rizel must have savings. But if the mage is truly poor, then it means he is stuck only at the 1st circle. From these words, Rizel bent over as if he had been hit in the solar plexus. But in the next moment, he suddenly straightened up and a bright flame flared in his hand. And then Rizel loudly declared that although he had not reached enlightenment and was stuck on the 2nd circle, the merchant had committed a sin by insulting the mage. However, Rizel's fiery speech was interrupted by a mug that crashed right into his face. From the blow, the mage fell to the floor, and then the surrounding world was engulfed in darkness. And there in the darkness, Rizel dreamed of his youth. To master mana, Rizel needed only half a year instead of the standard 2. Becoming a great mage was only a matter of time, but when Rizel got stuck on the 1st circle, the mentor abandoned him. Rizel became an outcast, but continued to believe that there was a way out. He dedicated his life to study and gain knowledge worthy even of archmages. But still, Rizal could not conquer the second circle. Now his life was literally in the hands of the great Saja of the Koguryo Empire. On the way to the camp, Huigaram asked, why are they returning earlier than expected because of that old man? Then Jinchon explained that the sorcerers of these lands are very wise and valuable people, and therefore one of them would be useful to Goguryeo. But in the next moment, Rizal suddenly came to his senses. His hands were tightly bound, but a simple rope could not hold a mage. He did not know the people in front of him, but guessed that they were the ones who stunned him and then captured him. Therefore, Rizal did not hold back and responded to the offenders with an energy arrow. But how surprised the mage was when Jinchon deflected the lightning with his bare hand, and Huigaram did not move at all. He just said the word block, and the lightning seemed to hit an invisible wall. After such a spectacle, Rizal realized that his kidnappers were not simple. So he activated a magical speech translation ring and asked the foreigners, "Who are you?" However, Jinchon answered the question with a question. How does a sorcerer know their native language? Rizal had to explain that it was all because of a magical artifact. Then he turned to Huigaram and asked, how did he manage to dissipate the power of his energy arrow? But in response, Huigaram only said that it was very rude to carelessly inquire about others' secret techniques. Rizal was about to object, but Huigaram stopped him and ordered him to be silent. The reason was that their path was blocked by a gang of armed robbers, and they were led by the very guard at the gate, whose name was Kalsuman. Losing a steady source of income because of momentary greed was very foolish, but there were quite a lot of goods on the foreigner's wagon. Therefore, Kalsuman gave in to temptation and decided to seize the valuable cargo and simply get rid of its owners. But before Kalsuman could give the command to his thugs, two of them were suddenly engulfed in flames. It was the work of Huigaram and his magical scrolls. Meanwhile, Jinchon said to Kalsuman with a sinister smile that he had a very familiar face. In response, Kalsuman ordered the other thugs to finish off the foreigners. But at that very second, Huigaram threw 3 more magical scrolls, and 3 more robbers were consumed by flames. Ignoring the people burning alive, Jinchon leisurely headed straight towards Kalsuman. One bandit dared to block the path of the great Saja, but immediately paid with his life. At such a sight, the remaining bandits instantly lost all their courage. Kalsuman urged them to attack, but in the next moment Huigaram deprived him of his last comrades. Now Kalsuman was left one-on-one with Jinchon. Fear paralyzed the guard, and now all he could do was helplessly watch as Jinchon raised his sword. However, instead of a deadly blow, he suddenly struck Kalsuman on the head with the flat side of the blade. Then Jinchon even crouched down in front of the guard and continued to shower him with steel slaps. It is unknown how long this torture would have lasted if Huigaram had not hurried his commander. Reluctantly, he obeyed the shaman and suddenly pulled a magical scroll from under his cloak. Then Jinchon pronounced the spell of tearing fire, and the scroll in his hand immediately flared with blue flames. And Kalsuman suddenly screamed in pain, shuddered all over, and fell dead to the ground. However, Jinchon was dissatisfied with the result of the spell and admitted with annoyance that magic was not really his forte. Then Huigaram calmed his commander and stated that if everyone could easily do magic, then it would not be magic. Meanwhile, Rizal, observing from the side, wondered, how could this foreigner use magic by uttering only a keyword? But then he noticed that his kidnappers were heading towards the Laganza mountain range, where a dragon dwells. It was then that Rizal guessed that the foreigner before him was the dragon who had taken the form of an ordinary man. If Rizal could become the dragon's servant, then with his help he could advance to the second circle. Meanwhile, Huigaram approached the mage and with a smile asked for forgiveness for the inconvenience and kidnapping. However, in response, Rizal assured that he was ready to carry out any order of the Lord. Such a change in behavior surprised Huigaram and Jinchon. But on the other hand, it would be easier for them if the mage voluntarily followed them. By morning, the great Saja returned to his camp, and Rizal was amazed at how well organized the settlement in the Laganza Mountains was. And the soldiers of Goguryeo with their discipline and spirit could rival the royal ones. But Rizal was even more amazed when he saw 2 dwarves from the Titan clan, which was considered extinct after the divine demonic war 1,000 years ago. However, then Jinchon asked the mage, had he forgotten how he tried to harm Veron? In his defense, Rizal explained anxiously that he only intended to teach a lesson to the insolent merchant who insulted him. But Jinchon did not want to hear anything, and ordered Buru and Uru to take the mage to the place of execution. The brothers immediately carried out the will of the great Saja, and soon he appeared before the accused, dressed in the emperor's robes. Jinchon could not forgive Rizal's attempt to harm his guide and one of the subjects of the Goguryeo Empire. The mage tried again to explain that it was all just a misunderstanding, and he did not intend to harm Veron. However, Jinchon was adamant and declared that the mage insulted him by trying to harm his subordinate. Rizal was about to object, but Jinchon raised his voice and said that the matter was not that good punishes evil, but that the strong take everything, such as natural selection. However, in response, Rizal dared to say that he was kidnapped, so he was forced to defend himself. But Jinchon had a different opinion. Moreover, he admitted that he could have simply ordered his men to kill Rizal on the spot. Besides, he turned out to be weak and even as a mage did not command respect. From these words, Rizal felt truly miserable because they were true. The mage had lived all 75 years in vain. But then the great Saja asked Rizal, would he continue to live wandering like a beggar and enduring insults? Or would he tie his fate to the Goguryeo Empire? Rizal was confused by the question and clarified what exactly Jinchon meant. Then he had to explain that Goguryeo did not need an outstanding mage, but a sage possessing deep knowledge about this world. Then the great Saja approached Rizal and asked one last time, would he accept the offer? The mage did not dare to look at Jinchon, but still dared to ask, what was the Goguryeo Empire ready to do for him? Then in response, Jinchon declared that one should not stand aside when someone offends his family and subordinates. And therefore if anyone dares to look down on Rizal, the Goguryeo Empire will grind the insolent into dust. After these words, Rizal respectfully bowed before the great Saja and swore that he would serve him as his mentor. Jinchon was satisfied with this answer, and then he declared that from this moment Rizal would teach Buru and Uru. The brothers were stunned by such news, but the great Saja insisted that his generals must master the local language. This also applied to Rizal. Instead of relying on the power of the artifact, he must learn the language of the Goguryeo Empire. And until then, the Ring of Magic translation would stay with Jinchon. Rizal expected to be treated like a simple servant. However, he could not have foreseen that he would be entrusted with teaching 2 generals of the Goguryeo army. Only the students from Buru and Uru were hopeless. At midnight, Rizal was visited by the great Saja to inquire about the progress in training. And also Jinchon suddenly returned the mage his ring and reported that it was broken. Rizal immediately checked the artifact, but the magical translation ring was intact. The mage wanted to explain to Jinchon that to activate the artifact it was necessary to pronounce a spell, but he had already left. Meanwhile, Veron and Kverion had already finished all their business in the city, and were now returning to the camp. However, Kverion's sharp hearing caught something that made him stop the cart. Then the swordsman quickly dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground. Veron asked anxiously what was happening, but instead of an answer, Kverion declared that they would abandon the wagon immediately. Veron did not argue and silently took cover with Kverion in the forest, but not far from the road. And very timely, because soon a detachment of Baron Elvin's knights approached the abandoned cart. After inspecting the cart, the lieutenant ordered his men to disperse and search for the fugitives. The knights immediately began to inspect the surroundings, and 2 of them headed straight to Verona's shelter with Kverion. Veron was already prepared to say goodbye to life, but to his surprise, Kverion instantly finished off the first knight and captured the second. Pressing the blade to the knight's neck, Kverion promised that if he answered his questions honestly, he could return home to his wife and children. Only the knight warned in response that he had no wife. Kverion pretended not to hear this and asked, "Why are the knights looking for them?" In response, the knight explained that an order had come from the kingdom of Hyen to recruit soldiers, so Baron Elvin was rounding up peasants to meet the quota. Now Kverion understood why the mercenaries had captured Verona's village, and therefore he had to report this to the great Saja as soon as possible. The knight answered the question honestly, so Kverion decided to honestly keep his promise. However, he forbade the knight from returning the same way and, pointing in another direction, ordered him to go until he counted to 1,000. The knight rejoiced at his luck and obediently ran in the indicated direction. However, soon a scream full of horror came from behind the trees. The knight did not know that there was a cliff in that direction, but Kverion did. Nevertheless, he did not feel any pangs of conscience because he had fulfilled the given promise. Only Kverion did not think that the knight's death cries would attract his comrades. Meanwhile, a very worried Sarah visited Buru. The girl asked when her uncle would return, to which Buru replied that Veron would arrive tomorrow morning. However, from Sarah's anxious face, Buru understood that his words did not comfort the girl much. Then he directly asked what was troubling her, to which Sarah admitted that the road at night was dangerous because of the punitive squads. However, in response to the girl's concerns, Buru suddenly laughed loudly. And then, through laughter, he explained that Sarah should not worry so much because her uncle was Kverion, who was nicknamed the Battle Doll. And at that very moment, Kverion was ready to confirm his nickname once again. As soon as he drew his sword, the knights all rushed into attack as a crowd. But Kverion in the blink of an eye moved behind their backs and with a single swing of his sword, beheaded all the knights at once. At such a sight, Veron was stunned until Kverion urged him to hurry. But no sooner had he taken a step than the forest shook with a thunderous roar, And then a two-headed ogre emerged from behind the trees. He was considered the king of all land monsters, but Veron assumed that if Kverion could kill all the knights with one blow, he could handle the ogre as well. But when Veron turned around, he only saw Kverion running away, flashing his heels. Meanwhile, a meeting of the high officers was taking place in the Koguryo camp. However, it was soon interrupted by an urgent report. Smoke was seen above the northern border tower. This meant that something had happened in the village of farmers with whom Koguryo traded. The village was half the day's journey away, so Jinchon ordered to leave minimal guards in the camp, and for everyone else to prepare for the march. In the next moment, the Koguryo camp came alive and buzzed with activity. The confused Rizel rushed to Chuncheon's tent to find out why the assembly had begun. But how surprised the mage was when he saw a battle-ready detachment already in front of the great Saja's tent. Rizel had traveled across the entire continent, but had never before seen such disciplined troops. Meanwhile, Chuncheon came out to the warriors and ordered Uru to take a mage with him. Then the great Saja personally addressed Rizel and asked, had he ever been on a battlefield? In response, the mage admitted that in his long life he had participated in wars more than once. Then Chuncheon ordered him to observe today's battle, and afterwards report on how the fighting style of Goguryeo differs from that of this kingdom. And then the camp gates swung open, and the great Saja ordered the ghostly cavalry to advance. Meanwhile, chaos and despair reigned in the northern village of the farmers. Baron Elven ordered his knights to drive all the useless people into the village, except men capable of fighting and young women. And then he ordered the archers to burn the settlement to the ground along with its inhabitants. However, this village seemed too small to Baron Elven. Then Tulumen reported that the prisoners spoke of a larger settlement located very nearby. At this news, Baron Elven smiled bloodthirstily and declared with anticipation that the hunt would be fun. Meanwhile, Veron and Kveron managed to hide from the two-headed ogre. However, soon they were tracked down by another monster called a goblin. Kverion noticed him too late, for which he paid, receiving a stone to the forehead. Veron tried to say something important, but Kverion did not listen and kicked the goblin back with all his might. Only after that did Veron manage to explain that it was a goblin baby, and it would be better not to touch it. And in the next moment, Kverion understood why. A whole crowd of angry goblins appeared from behind the trees. By that time, the ghostly cavalry of Koguryo had reached the northern village of the farmers. More precisely, what was left of it. Unfortunately, there was no one left to save. Chuncheon ordered Huigaram to make a halt and post sentries. But then Rizel approached the great Saja with one of the enemy's arrows, and reported that judging by the emblem on the tip, it was the personal punitive squad of Baron Elven. Chuncheon had heard that the Baron rarely visits these lands, so he became curious why. Then Rizel explained that the reason was the fierce monsters living here, and sending an army against them would mean huge losses. Since the city at the foot of the Laganza Mountains is a trading one, many want to buy their way out of conscription. Therefore, in the kingdom of Heian, it is common to buy slaves to send them to war instead of their own sons. And it seems that Baron Elven plans to use the farmers exactly in this way. Chuncheon called it madness and stated that in this way the kingdom of Heian would never win. But in response, Rizel revealed that everything was much worse, because the kingdom simply did not care, whether it won or lost. All because the kingdom of Heian was squeezed between giant empires. On land it bordered two great powers, and across the sea, a maritime empire. Therefore, the kingdom always depended on the whims and demands of strong neighbors. At the beginning of each war, it survived by supplying troops to both sides, so it does not matter who wins and who loses. Such is the reality of the kingdom of Heian. After these words, Chuncheon finally understood that no one protected these lands, because the kingdom had already abandoned its statehood. But suddenly a scout ran up to the great Saja and reported that an enemy camp had been discovered, with about 20 horsemen and 600 infantrymen. The scouts also saw about 200 people locked in cages in the camp. Most likely, the punitive detachment of Baron Elven decided to rest before the raid on the next village. The scouts' report ended there, and then Chuncheon ordered his warriors to prepare for the offensive. Meanwhile, in Baron Elven's camp, knights were cruelly mocking the captured peasants. They beat the men with whips to intimidate and break them, and the knights decided to amuse themselves and violate the women. But not everyone had fun that night. The sentries were forced to keep watch far from the camp. They became the first victims of the Koguryo scouts. When the last sentry was done away with, Huigar ordered to send the signal. One of the scouts immediately released 2 pigeons into the sky. This meant that all escape routes were blocked. Meanwhile, far from the camp, Chuncheon noticed the signal. But before starting the attack, the great Saja ordered Rizel to carefully watch their battle. And only then did Chuncheon draw his sword. And at that very second, all the Koguryo archers drew their arrows to the bowstrings. Baron Elven's men continued to drink and have fun sitting by the fire. Suddenly, a stout blonde man tore himself away from his mug of drink and suspiciously began to peer into the night sky. An unusual whistling sound joined the general noise. No matter how the man looked, he could not find the source of the whistle, but it was definitely not a bird. The man's eyes widened with horror when he finally realized what exactly was making that strange sound. But it was already too late. A hail of arrows pierced every warrior by the campfire, leaving no chance of survival. A commotion immediately broke out in the camp. Soldiers quickly grabbed their weapons, not fully understanding where exactly the attack was coming from. Amid all the noise, Baron Elven ran out of his tent wearing only a nightshirt. He was extremely surprised by what was happening and immediately demanded explanations. But the soldiers, not even sparing the Baron a glance, continued to run chaotically around the camp searching for the enemy, too occupied with their own survival. Finally, the Baron's loyal knight Teluman rushed up to him. He immediately asked Elven to take shelter in the tent and remain calm as it was quite dangerous outside. Despite the warning, Baron Elven did not hurry. Carefully observing the general chaos, he demanded that Teluman immediately take control of the situation. Only after that did Baron Elven decide to hide in the tent, and Teluman immediately began issuing orders to his subordinates. Teluman was extremely irritated by the outcome of events. Who could dare to attack them? After a few minutes, Teluman managed to take control of the situation. The spearmen lined up in 2 ranks at the camp entrance, the archers positioned behind them and were ready to open fire. Everyone, waiting, began to peer into the night gloom, hoping to catch a glimpse of the enemy. And then, to everyone's surprise, the enemy cavalry appeared on the horizon. Teluman immediately decided that their opponents were not among the villagers, but they also did not resemble a regular army. A satisfied smile played on his face when he saw that the riders were aiming at them with bows. Could it be that the enemy was unaware that shooting from horseback reduces accuracy? Nevertheless, Teluman immediately gave the order to the archers to draw their bows and shoot as soon as the enemy was within striking distance. But the first to shoot was Jinchon along with his horsemen. Yet this did not scare Teluman at all, since it was impossible to hit from such a distance. Nevertheless, instincts prevailed, and Teluman was able to dodge an arrow flying straight at him at the last moment. Looking back, he was horrified. The first row of his archers had been struck by enemy arrows, but this simply could not be. Without wasting time, Jinchon drew his bowstring again, intending to hit Teluman after all. But as before, he still managed to deflect the attack. Unfortunately, behind him the death moans of his archers were heard again. In a fury, Teluman ordered the spearmen to immediately block the enemy cavalry. The soldiers immediately thrust their spears forward, awaiting the clash with the horses. But Jinchon intended to break through the enemy formation using a wedge. The horsemen immediately took the necessary formation, and the great Saja himself took the lead. At full gallop, the cavalry charged into the defensive line, easily crushing everything in their path. Teluman was horrified by what was happening and shouted with all his might for the soldiers to attack the horses. The mustached soldier, who was closest to Jinchon, tried to attack the great Saja's horse, but the spear only treacherously slid off the armor. Only then did the soldier realize that the horses were fully clad in iron. But it was already too late. A second later, his skull was crushed under the horse's hooves. The soldiers in the camp fled in terror, begging for mercy. But the horsemen had no intention of stopping, let alone pitying their opponents, for they had come here to save the tillers of the soil. The horsemen under the command of Jinchon rushed deep into the camp, while Buru remained to command the detachment of infantrymen who had already managed to approach the camp. Under the cover of shield-bearers, Buru's detachment followed the horsemen, but met fierce resistance from the camp defenders. A battle broke out. Nevertheless, the warriors of Goguryeo managed to push back the enemy despite being outnumbered. Baron Elven ran out of the tent again. He could not understand where such a large army had come from, since judging by the armor, they did not belong to the Imperial Army. With a sword in his hands, Teluman immediately ran up to the Baron, insisting that Elven retreat. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, Baron Elven agreed with him. Nevertheless, he promised to return for his soldiers and bring the royal army as reinforcements. One of the soldiers who was supposed to secure the retreat path ran up to them shouting, and reported that all the routes out of the camp were blocked. Meanwhile, Kvigaram, with a small detachment, was pressing the mercenaries who guarded the cages with prisoners. A handful of mercenaries, realizing that the situation was turning against them, decided to flee, but Jinchon with his horsemen immediately appeared to oppose them. Seeing that the situation was under control, Jinchon ordered Kvigaram to guard the wagons, while he with the cavalry would help Buru deal with the remaining enemy. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries, who seemed to have already accepted defeat, grabbed a torch and rushed to the cages with prisoners intending to burn them. Desperate cries of the nephews sounded. They realized the hopelessness of the situation. Cursing to himself, Kvigaram realized his miscalculation and what it could threaten him with in the future. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and recited a spell. The torch in the mercenary's hands flared brighter. Then the flame engulfed the mercenary and the wretched screams of the unfortunate sounded. It did not last long. After a few seconds the flame died out, and only a charred skeleton remained of the mercenary. Baron Elven, Tillman, and a handful of soldiers lucky enough to survive were surrounded by a tight ring of Koguryo warriors. Tillman realized the situation they found themselves in. Out of 600 soldiers, only 100 survived the attack. Then Baron Elven decided to use the last trump card up his sleeve. Stepping forward, he loudly declared that he was a nobleman of the kingdom of Hyen, and such treatment of his person was unacceptable. The Koguryo warriors froze in place, and a satisfied smile appeared on Baron Elven's face. He decided to press the advantage while it seemed to be on his side. It turns out these warriors knew the laws of war. Feeling confident, Baron Elven immediately demanded the commander to appear. The Koguryo warriors parted, and Chuncheon approached the Baron on horseback. As expected, Baron Elven introduced himself and expected his interlocutor to show the same courtesy. But to his surprise, Chuncheon ignored him. Turning around, Chuncheon inquired where Kaverian was now. Sighing heavily, Buru reported that he had not yet returned from the village. Then the great Saja asked Rizel, who was nearby, for the magical communication ring. The old mage immediately obeyed his lord's command, but for the ring to work it was necessary to say the activation phrase. Raising his hand, Chuncheon said, "Activation phrase," but nothing happened. Then he tried to address Baron Elven, but from his facial expression it became clear that the ring did not work. Rizel said embarrassedly that the great Saja said the wrong words, and then asked Chuncheon to repeat exactly after him. The old mage said, "Interpretation," and again lowering his hand, Chuncheon tried to say the required word, but to his shame he failed on the first attempt. The outcome of the battle was already decided, so Tillman asked the Baron for permission to take the situation into his own hands. Elven looked at his knight with interest. Could he have a better plan? Bowing his head, Tillman immediately explained the essence of his plan, and a satisfied smile appeared on Baron Elven's face. Meanwhile, Rizel reminded again that Chuncheon must repeat the word exactly. Finally, the great Saja managed to say the word interpretation, and the ring immediately glowed pale blue. Rizel clapped his hands joyfully. Chuncheon again addressed the Baron, asking if he understood his speech. Elven nodded affirmatively. Then Tillman stepped forward and introduced himself as a knight of Baron Elven's house. In turn, Chuncheon declared that he was a messenger of the great Goguryeo Empire. The last words made Tillman think. There was no country with a similar name on this continent, yet they dared to call themselves an empire. Of course, Chuncheon assumed that since Tillman stepped forward, he wished to continue the battle. But the outcome of the further battle was already clear to Tillman, so he asked Chuncheon to duel him. At first, the great Saja hesitated, but then he accepted the challenge after all, since before him stood a knight. Tillman thanked Chuncheon for the honor. Baron Elven's face spread into a satisfied smile. It turned out Tillman was right, and the Empire's envoy accepted the challenge. The Baron had no doubt about Tillman's victory, as he was a renowned swordsman. He also hoped to turn the tide of the battle by taking Chuncheon hostage. Dismounting, Chuncheon passed unhindered through the ring of knights protecting Baron Elven. Roaring fiercely, Tillman drew his sword, and its blade immediately was engulfed in a bright glow. Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise, for it was an aura. What was a man with the rank of royal guard doing in such a wilderness? Chuncheon also drew his blade and urged Tillman to attack, while Rizel advised dodging the attacks, since the opponent possessed an aura. But it was already too late. Tillman raised his blade and rushed into the attack, intending to end the fight with a single strike. Chuncheon managed to react. There was a clang of metal, and Tillman's sword split in half. Tillman stared in horror at what was formerly called a sword. He could not understand how this could have happened. The sword of Chuncheon radiated an aura, although he did not even direct it. Baron Elven rushed fearfully to his knight, trying to find out if he was all right. But to his surprise, Tillman did not respond, frozen in place. Approaching closer, Elven cautiously touched the knight. Tillman made gurgling sounds, and then his body split into two equal halves. Warm blood splashed onto the Baron. Stepping back, he collapsed to the ground. His face was distorted with a grimace of horror. Above him immediately loomed the terrifying figure of Chuncheon. At that moment, he looked more like a monster than a man. Out of fear, Baron Elven even wet himself. Rizel, who was carefully watching the duel, finally realized that the invisible surge of mana at the moment far exceeded a simple aura. That was why Tillman lost. Turning around, Chuncheon gave the order for the army to return home, and the soldiers marched back in formation. Slowly trailing behind, Rizel pondered what kind of place this was. The Goguryeo Empire? The sun was already high in the sky, and the riders still continued their journey. Among the warriors was Rizel. He was lost in thought and noticed nothing around. Rizel knew better than anyone what was happening on the continent, but he had never heard of an army with such military power as the warriors of the Goguryeo Empire. Uru, noticing the teacher's inner turmoil, rode up to him and asked what was happening. Then Rizel decided to ask after all. From where exactly did the Goguryeo troops come to the continent? Uru did not quite understand the essence of the question, since it was obvious that they came from the Goguryeo Empire. But Rizel meant something slightly different. He was more interested in exactly where the empire was located. Here Uru pondered. They had just been sailing on the ship for 3 days, that's all. Rizel, however, knows his camp's location, so why such questions? Of course, Rizel already understood that the interlocutor was not particularly smart, since the lake is quite a closed body of water. So how did they sail for 3 days? This question stunned Uru, so he had to explain in detail how they broke through the raging sea. Hearing the story, Rizel was amazed at how the warriors could get caught in a storm and end up in the lake of the Laganza Mountains, yet he still had some suspicions. Finally, the horsemen reached the fortress gates, and one of the warriors, announcing the arrival of the great Saji, immediately demanded the guards to open the gates. When the gates were already open and the procession was ready to enter the protected territory, a cry suddenly came from the forest, growing louder and louder. The source of such a loud sound turned out to be Kvaerion, who, bursting out of the forest, rushed towards Jinchon. Running up, he immediately dropped to one knee and reported that troops had set out from the city to capture the peasants, so it was necessary to urgently gather forces. Having listened carefully to the report, Jinchon, measuring Kvaerion with a dissatisfied look, did not deign to answer him. Then Kvaerion, lowering his head again, said that he had ridden day and night without rest to report this to the great Saje. Nevertheless, Jinchon, without uttering a word, moved towards the fortress. Kvaerion, not understanding, remained watching him go. Buru immediately drove up to him and explained that they had just returned after killing all the enemies, so Kvaerion was late with the report. Buru also advised Kvaerion to change clothes, as he looked extremely miserable. The sun was already setting when Kvaerion appeared before Jinchon and reported everything that had happened to him during that time. How he bravely killed all the pursuers and then managed to escape from 1,000 orcs who were chasing him. Nevertheless, Jinchon was not impressed by the story. Kvaerion simply threw away everything he had bought with the money earned from selling the skins they had collected for months, and just ran away. Only now did Kvaerion fully realize how his feet looked from the outside, and began quietly cursing Baron Elven, because of whom he got into such trouble. Hearing the Baron's name, Jinchon ordered Huigaram to immediately bring the prisoner. A few minutes later, 2 guards brought Baron Elven. He looked miserable, his hands were tied, and his nightshirt still smelled of urine. Despite his situation, Baron Elven immediately stated that a nobleman of the kingdom should not be treated this way. According to international law, he must be treated according to his status. Then Jinchon gave a meaningful look to the old mage as if asking if this was true. And Rizel immediately nodded, confirming every word of the Baron. Since decorum demanded it, Jinchon nevertheless decided to give Baron Elven a worthy reception. As ransom, the Baron offered 1,000 gold coins. Moreover, he could ask the king to grant independence to this region. The proposal made this great Saju think, because they really needed a place where they could settle down. So the phrase about independence sounded very timely. Moreover, Baron Elven understood that the army of the Goguryeo Empire had not yet sworn allegiance to anyone, so he was ready to take them under his command. Hearing this, Buru and Uru immediately drew their weapons, intending to behead the insolent who dared to defy their ruler. But Jinchon quickly tempered their ardor, strictly ordering them not to dare be rude to Baron Elven. Reluctantly, the brothers still had to obey. Jinchon immediately returned to the Baron's proposal. Alvin also promised to ensure them the best reception. And then the great Saja pondered, while Baron Elven began to rejoice mentally, for if he played everything correctly, he would not only get out of here, but also receive elite troops. Finally, after thinking everything over carefully, Jinchon apologized to Baron Elven for the inconvenience caused and ordered the guards to release him immediately. Rubbing his numb hands quite a bit, Baron Elven said that for a talent like Jinchon, he was ready to endure even greater troubles. The great Saja thanked the Baron again for his boundless generosity. But, as it seemed to him, there was still one more problem. Jinchon was worried that his subordinates might encounter the Baron's soldiers on his lands, and that this could escalate into a serious conflict. But Baron Elven assured that it was not a problem, since now only the guard remained on his territory. Moreover, he personally commands it, so no problems should arise. Jinchon was also worried about the provisions, because the large number of warriors could cause problems with them. But even this the Baron did not consider a problem, for his estate had enough supplies to support an army for more than half a year. Satisfied with the answers, Jinchon thanked Baron Elven once again and suggested he rest. When the formalities were over, Jinchon ordered the guards to remove the communication ring from the Baron's neck. As soon as the guards carried out the order, and the Baron could no longer understand what those around him were saying, the great Saja ordered Elven to be taken to the captive peasants. The guards nodded affirmatively and immediately escorted Baron Elven out the door. As soon as the order was executed, Rizel immediately asked why Jinchon acted this way, since the Baron would surely be beaten to death there. Smiling quite contentedly, the great Saja replied that if Baron Elven died, then that was his fate. Then he ordered Huigaram to gather the army. The day after tomorrow morning they would set out. He only nodded affirmatively. Rizel did not quite understand why Jinchon needed soldiers, since there were almost no troops left on the Baron's territory. A malicious smile ran across Jinchon's face. In fact, he wanted Kaverion to return the principal amount in interest for the lost cart. Moreover, since there were almost no troops left on the Baron's territory, they had a chance to make a good profit, because the most fun in war is looting. When the cage door slammed shut, Baron Elven was beside himself with anger. How dare these ragamuffins treat their future lord this way? The guards, not deigning to answer the Baron, withdrew. Then the Baron supposed that perhaps it was some kind of mistake. But realizing the harsh reality, Baron Elven kicked the wooden bars of the cage in frustration. Do these savages even understand how things are done? Looking around, the Baron finally realized that he was not alone in the dungeon. A couple of dozen eyes cast an unfriendly glance at Elven. These were the very plowmen whom Elven had personally captured not long ago. The irony being that the Baron himself ended up in captivity. The prisoners did not react at all to the Baron's appearance. Only their gaze revealed all the hatred that the people felt towards Elven. A stocky blond man took out a wineskin and was about to properly quench his thirst, but Elven immediately demanded the wineskin for himself. The man did not utter a word and looked contemptuously at Baron Elven, but did not move from his place. The Baron was annoyed by the peasant's stupidity. Sighing heavily, Elven approached the fair-haired man and with a kick sharply knocked the wineskin out of his hands. From the unexpected blow, the man staggered and fell to the ground, and Elven, without wasting time, began to brutally beat the poor fellow with his feet. The blond man tried to defend himself from the blows as best he could and kept begging for mercy, but the Baron was deaf to his pleas. Theodore could no longer watch the beating and was about to rush to help the fair-haired man, but Simon sharply stopped his friend, reminding him that the guards would kill them if Baron Elven got hurt. Before Theodore's eyes, scenes of the recent horror that the Baron and his men had wrought in his village surfaced. Isn't Simon and the others at all angered that even in such a situation Baron Elven allows himself to behave this way? Although the others present were ashamed, they could do nothing, so they could only silently observe what was happening. Finally finishing this beating, Baron Elven laughed heartily. Even now he was above all these nobodies. Theodore was not satisfied with this state of affairs. Breaking free from Simon's grasp, he jumped at the Baron and struck him in the face. From surprise and audacity, Baron Elven did not manage to defend himself. Blood immediately poured from his broken nose, and staggering, Elven fell to the ground, painfully hitting his head on the wooden bars. After regaining some composure, Baron Elven began to scream for the guards, but no one intended to come at his cries. Turning around, the Baron smiled kindly as much as his battered face allowed and asked for forgiveness. But Theodore did not want apologies. He wished for Elven to atone for his guilt with death. And raising his hand, he began mercilessly beating the Baron. The next day, all those who were in the cage stood before the great Saja, who together with his advisors, was seated on a wooden platform. The guards also brought Theodore, whose hands were tied. Beside the covered cloth lay the mutilated body of Baron Elven. Glaring sternly at the man, Jinchon inquired why Theodore had killed the Baron, but Theodore only silently looked at Jinchon. Then the guards, deciding that it was too bold not to answer the ruler, knocked him to the ground and began kicking him. When the guards finished, Jinchon repeated his question again, to which Theodore replied that he simply destroyed the enemy. This answer pleased Jinchon, and a satisfied smile lit up his face, for revenge is the right of every person. Then he asked everyone who was in the cage who among them had raised a hand against Baron Elven. Theodore cried out in despair that only he was involved in the death of Baron Elven. All the others tried to stop him. That was enough for Jinchon. The guards immediately grabbed Theodore and dragged him away. Buru immediately followed them. The great Saja, smiling, said that the life of one nobleman is worth more than the lives of 10 parasites, and that is exactly what the prisoners are. Therefore, Jinchon offered the other 9 parasites to die voluntarily, and the rest he would turn into slaves. Although the great Saja offered life to all the others in exchange for 9 sacrifices, no one volunteered. Suddenly Simon rose from his knees and, despite his family's protests, asked if it was really impossible to manage with only them. But Jinchon firmly decided that there must be 9 sacrifices. When the guards were taking Simon away, he turned to the great Saja. He hoped that even if the required number was not reached, his family would still be spared. When Simon disappeared from sight, Jinchon again addressed the crowd. There were still 8 people left. One by one, the men stood up and offered themselves as victims. But when there were still 4 volunteers to be gathered, the crowd suddenly fell silent. No one else wanted to die. People shamefully hid their eyes. They were ashamed of their weakness. Jinchon was very dissatisfied with this outcome. He ordered Huigaram to provide housing and means of subsistence for the families of those who sacrificed themselves. From now on, they will become subjects of the Goguryeo Empire. As for the rest, Jinchon ordered them to be locked back in the cages. Every single one of them is now a slave. Finally coming to his senses, Theodore, not fully understanding what was happening at all, tried to get up, but a sharp pain below his back made him lie down again. Looking around, Theodore noticed Varon sitting near his bunk and tried to find out from him what was going on. Varon, smiling, explained that it was all a test. Everyone who volunteered to sacrifice themselves became people of the Goguryeo Empire along with their families, while the rest became slaves. Theodore was extremely surprised by this turn of fate, as he was sure he had died. After all, the pain he felt before losing consciousness was real. It seems Jinchon never intended to kill anyone, but only wanted to check if there was even a drop of will in the peasants. However, to make everything look real, Buru gave each of the victims a jab with the axe blade in the butt. The next day, Buru and Sarah, sitting on a stone, watched as the slaves, under the guard's supervision, worked the field. Suddenly, Sarah decided to ask why these people decided to become slaves. At first, Buru thought, then answered that the most important thing for a person is the ability to wield a sword. These people refused to take up arms, that is why they became slaves. After all, if a person cannot sacrifice themselves in peacetime, nothing will change when the enemy attacks. Once Burr asked a similar question to the great Sage, to which Jinchon replied that anyone can survive, but not everyone can enjoy freedom. Even wild animals understand what freedom is, and are ready to do anything for it. Therefore, people must always remember why they take the sword in their hands. Just like that, without a reason, it is impossible to become strong. To protect one's freedom, a person must take up the sword, but for that, he must understand freedom. The ghostly cavalry galloped briskly through the forest under the cover of night. Suddenly, an order to stop was heard, and everyone immediately froze in place as one. Rizel, who was also among the horsemen, decided to take the opportunity to rest. After all, the cavalry had covered in 3 days the distance that usually took a week. Suddenly, the approaching Uru reported that Rizel was being called by the great Saja. The old mage immediately jumped off his horse and followed the general. Passing through the forest thicket, Rizel was very surprised to find Jinchon standing at the edge of the cliff. Without turning around, the great Saja asked if Rizel understands that the warriors of the Goguryeo Empire and the local people are different. Of course, Rizel was aware of this, for despite his deep knowledge, no empire of Goguryeo existed in the world known to him. The answer greatly surprised and disappointed Jinchon. Rizel had also heard nothing about the states of Baekje, Silla, Paedal, or Huan, nor about the Tang dynasty. Where had they ended up then? Then Rizel reported that they were on the continent of Haiyan, and ventured to suggest that Jinchon with the soldiers had crossed the interdimensional barrier and ended up in a completely different world. 10,000 years ago, the ancient dragon Besvard traveled the world and marked the coordinates of all the places he visited. There was a spell called teleportation that allowed movement through space between these coordinates. However, the mentioned Jinchon states were not at any of the coordinates, so Rizel assumed that they came from another dimension. The great Saju was very interested in this ancient dragon, how he could prove that he had been everywhere, and why Rizel believed it so blindly. Then Rizel explained that dragons are an ancient great race, which no army in the world can approach. Smiling, Jinchon pointed to the emblem on his chest. It depicted the raven Samjoko, a divine beast that fed on dragons. Passing by, the great Saja advised Rizel to no longer fear strange lizards, for he was the one who would crush them. Going out to his soldiers, who humbly awaited the return of their leader, Jinchon finally realized that they would not return back. A scout squad led by Kaverion skillfully crossed the distance to the fortress gates. Helping each other up, the soldiers managed to climb the wall, and then quickly and quietly approached 2 guards, who did not even notice their appearance. The first guard died quickly. The blade passed through so that the unfortunate man could not even scream. Kaverion quickly covered the second guard's mouth, putting a finger to his lips to signal that the guard must not make a sound if he wanted to stay alive. The guard nodded affirmatively. Kaverion promised to leave the guard and even fulfill any of his wishes if he honestly answered how many guards were on the territory. As soon as Kaverion withdrew his hand, The guard immediately reported that there were 12 guards in total and another 5 in reserve in the building behind the wall. Satisfied with the answer, Kaverion inquired what the guard wanted. Embarrassed and hesitating, the guard asked for mercy. But after a moment's thought, he asked for some money and a horse to get away from here. Kaverion agreed without a shadow of doubt, and a joyful smile lit up the guard's face. He could hardly believe his luck. But the smile immediately disappeared when Kaverion's blade pierced the guard's chest. A light signal was sent from the fortress wall to the horsemen hiding in the forest thicket. Seeing the signal, Jinchon ordered to move quietly and quickly. They planned to attack only Baron Elven's estate. Touching ordinary people was forbidden. Kaverion's reconnaissance squad quickly dealt with all the guards on the fortress wall and raised the grate. Therefore, the horsemen infiltrated the late Baron Elven's estate without any problems. Jinchon praised Kaverion and his squad and gave the order to move to the next gate. The soldiers immediately rushed to carry out the order. As soon as Kaverion and his men disappeared from sight, Jinchon divided the horsemen into squads, which were to disperse and move toward the castle. If the squad suddenly encounters a patrol, eliminate on the spot without unnecessary talk. As soon as the squads reach their positions and hear the signal horn, the assault on the estate can begin. As soon as the orders were given, the horsemen moved towards the castle, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Meanwhile, Rizel, together with a small detachment by order of Jinchon, remained in the forest until the battle ended. His task was to determine what among all the loot had the greatest value, for Jinchon had stormed the estate solely for profit. Moreover, Rizel needed to find books and maps that would help Jinchon and his people survive in these lands. Sitting by the campfire and thoughtfully gazing into the flames, Rizel came to the conclusion that Jinchon had indeed decided to settle in these parts. Suddenly, a strange sound resembling the whistle of a released arrow was heard. At first, Rizel and the other soldiers thought it was the signal to start the assault. But suddenly, Rizel's eyes widened with horror when he finally realized what was the source of that sound. Without unnecessary explanation, he sharply dashed to the horses, simultaneously ordering the soldiers to immediately move out to the castle. Of course, the soldiers did not understand why there was such a rush all of a sudden, but they did not contradict or stop the mage. Untying the horse, Rizel scolded himself for his carelessness. He could not have imagined that there was a liaison mage in the castle. The soldier nearby tried to calm the old mage, assuring that they would deal with the mage before he delivered the message. But Rizel was clearly not satisfied with such a turn of events. Mounting his horse, he galloped with all his might towards the estate. Soldiers hurriedly began saddling their horses. Of course, Rizel understood perfectly well that it was necessary to stop the mage before the news reached the capital. Otherwise, no one would leave here alive. The phantom cavalry, led by Jinchon, still managed to break through the main gates of the castle and burst into the adjacent territory. But a unit of spearmen immediately came out to meet the cavalry, and a fierce battle ensued. The defenders, caught off guard, defended themselves as best they could, but the numerical advantage was not on their side. The cavalry was ordered to kill everyone who offered any resistance. No one was to escape. Fierce battles raged throughout the territory adjacent to the castle, the ranks of spearmen melting before their eyes. As soon as the Goguryeo warriors managed to break through to the castle, Jinchon ordered Uru to infiltrate inside and clear the estate. A small detachment led by Uru, having broken down the main doors, entered the estate. Uru promised that if anyone managed to leave the estate alive, he would personally tear off the head of the offender. The soldiers immediately dispersed, while Uru, accompanied by 2 knights, decided to first inspect the basement, as something interesting could usually be hidden there. Carefully descending the spiral staircase, Uru suddenly heard a strange sound, and with a gesture ordered the 2 soldiers to stop. Pressing his ear to the wall, he began to listen to the suspicious sound. It was clearly a human voice, so Uru, drawing his bowstring, signaled the soldiers to continue their descent, expecting an ambush at every step. Finally, having descended downstairs, Uru carefully peered around the corner and discovered a strange-looking man, most likely the local jailer. Without much thought, Uru fired a shot. Moans were heard, followed by a dull thud. Since the dungeon was quite dark, Uru ordered to find a torch. When the light illuminated the dungeon, Uru and the soldiers found the jailer dead, an arrow piercing him through, pinning the poor man to the wall. Carefully examining the cell, to his surprise, Uru and the soldiers found a girl chained to the wall. The warriors were enchanted by the woman's beauty, her skin white as jade and her ears were pointed. Of course, the Goguryeo warriors did not know that the chained girl was an elf, so, deciding that a fairy stood before them, all 3 immediately fell to their knees. Opening her eyes, the elf was very surprised. A tall dwarf with a bow instead of an axe, and 2 humans. The proud lands bowed their heads before her. Could she be asleep? Meanwhile, the battle on the estate grounds was over. Most of the guards were killed. Some surrendered. Huigaram approached Jinchon and reported that they had killed everyone who even remotely resembled Baron Elvin's kin, and as proof showed a severed head. The great Saja was satisfied and ordered the bodies to be gathered. Suddenly, accompanied by soldiers, Rizal burst onto the estate grounds. Jinchon was extremely surprised by the appearance of the old mage, as he clearly had not given a signal. So what made Rizal leave his hiding place? Out of breath, Rizal reported that there was a communication mage on the estate grounds who needed to be eliminated immediately. Rizal was about to suggest questioning the family or the servants of Baron Elvin about the whereabouts of the mage, but noticing the severed head in Huigaram's hands, he was horrified. Then Uru appeared from the estate accompanied by 2 soldiers carrying a girl on his back. Running up to Jinchon, he reported that they had managed to save the fairy. Of course, Jinchon was already informed about the elves, but how did Uru manage to find the elf in Baron Elvin's estate? Rizal was about to explain to Uru that the figure behind him was not a human and certainly not a fairy. But Jinchon stopped him, noticing some movement on one of the towers. Rizal's eyes widened in horror. It was a communication mage who had already begun gathering energy. The communication spell acted like a magical beacon. The capital would instantly learn of their appearance, and judging by the mana, the mage could no longer be stopped. Jinchon smiled at Uru, and he understood everything without unnecessary words. Carefully lowering the bewildered elf to the ground, Uru took careful aim. But Rizal objected that it was impossible to hit from such a distance. Even an elf could not manage that, so the only option was to run. Nevertheless, Uru ignored the old mage's remark and after taking careful aim, fired. To everyone's surprise, the mana disappeared after a second, and the communication mage fell like a stone. The soldiers, urged on by Uru, actively carried the loot into the inner courtyard. Deciding to personally sort the loot, Uru, accompanied by 2 warriors, proceeded to the estate, where he encountered a soldier carrying a box with strange contents. Uru immediately asked the soldier if it would be possible to sell such strange things, but the soldier had no definite answer. Suddenly, a piercing scream was heard from the neighboring room, and Uru and the soldiers rushed there at once. Opening the door, they found Rizal lamenting over a broken vial of mandrake extract. Of course, Uru did not know how valuable this extract was, so he tried to calm the old mage. But the angry Rizal first ordered everyone to leave, and then pushed Uru and the soldiers out the door himself. As soon as the door slammed shut, Rizal, falling onto the carpet, continued to mourn his so precious loss. Then Uru decided to check how things were going in the central hall. The soldiers were diligently moving the loot. One of them, seeing Uru, immediately reported that they had taken out all the most valuable items. Looking around carefully, Uru noticed good quality plate armor that his subordinates had forgotten about. Pointing to the armor, Uru ordered them to collect it immediately. The soldiers did not quite understand why they needed extra weight in the wagons. Poking a soldier in the chest, Uru replied that they would melt down the armor into arrows or something truly necessary, since there was not enough iron in the camp. In the central hall, Jinchon thoughtfully examined all the loot that his subordinates had managed to find on the estate grounds. To transport everything, they clearly did not have enough carts. So Jinchon ordered Huigaram to take 40 soldiers and distribute the surplus grain to the townspeople, prioritizing those who looked poorer. So he ordered to break or crush those very plate armors before loading. The soldiers immediately began to carry out the order, while the prisoners watched in horror as an entire estate, which could have supported several years of living, was destroyed. Finally finishing work, the soldiers smiled quite a bit. Unexpectedly, a noise was heard near one of the walls surrounding the estate. Suddenly a hand appeared from under the ground, and then from the pit that had formed climbed out a suspicious-looking man in a hood. Shaking off the dirt, the man smirked quite a bit. He had finally managed to sneak onto the estate grounds. Removing his hood, the man only now noticed that several dozen astonished people clad in impressive armor were looking at him. Drawing his sword, the man named himself Gerard Gromov and smiling called the warriors of Koguryo to attack. But to his surprise, not a single soldier moved from his place. Only when Jinchon gave the order to seize Gerard did the soldiers move. Gerard was disappointed by such an attitude towards him. The best mercenaries bowed their heads as soon as they heard his name. He, the most majestic treasure hunter on the continent, one of the top 10 swordsmen, Gerard Thunderous, is greeted like this. But Gerard had barely finished his bravado when about a dozen arrows, flying past him, pierced the wall. One of them even scratched his cheek. Understanding that the numerical superiority was clearly not in his favor, and the opponents were serious, Gerard, throwing down his sword, decided to surrender. The soldiers, fearing that Gerard might do something foolish, tied him up with weapons pointed at him. And although Gerard had traveled across the entire continent, he saw people with black hair and eyes the color of a raven's wing for the first time. His thoughts were interrupted by hammer blows. The soldiers were destroying another batch of plate armor. Despite being a prisoner now, Gerard tried to stop the soldiers from such barbarism, as the armor was worth a lot of money. Then Jinchon decided to ask him if the armor was really that valuable. Gerard replied that one such set could support an ordinary family for 10 years. Fine engraving and decoration, such armor was not comparable to ordinary plate mail. Such armor was not shameful for a ruler of some state to wear. But the Goguryeo warriors, ignoring his remark, continued methodically destroying the armor. Then Gerard shouted again for the soldiers to stop. Finally, Jinchon gave the order to stop, hoping that at least something might have survived. But his hopes were dashed by Uru, who, smiling kindly, reported that he had personally dealt with the armor that the soldiers had not yet broken. Gerard was devastated. His carefree life was crying out. He was a treasure hunter who usually earned by clearing dungeons. But while the war was ongoing, he tried not to stand out and got by with small jobs. Hearing that Baron Elvin led the troops to the Laganza Mountains, Gerard came here to make some money. For him, the greatest hunter on the continent, robbing an empty house was a piece of cake. But everything went wrong. Although for a swordmaster like Gerard, escaping was easy. However, he surrendered on purpose. The reason was Gerard's professional illness, insatiable curiosity. He needed to learn everything about these strange people. An unexpected blow to the face snapped Gerard out of his thoughts. Of course, he immediately resented why Jinchon did it. But he, passing by, only said that Gerard should no longer dare to speak to him arrogantly, and henceforth report important matters immediately. Not understanding why he should report to Jinchon, since he was not his subject, Gerard decided to endure until he satisfied his curiosity. Rizel, examining the crushed armor, concluded that Jinchon acted wisely, since now they needed materials and iron more than money. Moreover, Rizel believed that in wartime money was trash, so it was better to melt everything down, especially since they could get much more for dwarf-made armor. Dawn was approaching and Jinchon gave the order to return. The wagons loaded with loot, accompanied by riders, left Baron Elvin's estate. In the morning, the townspeople, to their surprise, found bread and grain at their doors. The news of the defeat of Baron Elvin's estate quickly spread around. Of course, the residents did not know who could have done it and were very worried about possible consequences. Nevertheless, now they had enough grain to survive the winter. Wagons under the guard of the phantom cavalry slowly crossed the forest. Suddenly, one of the wagons, hitting a stone, broke a wheel and the procession was forced to stop. After inspecting the wheel, one of the soldiers rushed to the head of the caravan to report to Jinchon about what had happened. Gerard, taking advantage of the stop, decided to think about what to do next. They were heading towards the infamous Laganza Mountains. The Goguryeo cavalry was clad in chainmail from head to toe. Even the horses were armored. It was also strange that their mana felt completely alien. Even Gerard, a master swordsman, could not accurately assess their strength. Of course, he understood that one mistake and escape would become impossible. But worrying about trifles was not his style. Despite the threats of the guards, Gerard rose from his knees, performed a somersault, broke the wooden bars of the cage, and was free. An alarm was instantly raised, and as soon as Gerard's feet touched the ground, several warriors already aimed their bows at him. Nevertheless, he was not inclined to give up so easily. Skillfully dodging the shots, he rushed to the nearest wagon loaded with loot. It was in this wagon that his travel bag was located. Quickly rummaging through it, Gerard took out a communication bracelet and uttering the activation phrase, he finally understood what the Goguryeo soldiers were saying. Hwigaram, who had managed to run to the noise, immediately ordered the other prisoners to calm down, dismount, and seize Gerard. Hwigaram's goal was to prevent Gerard from seizing a weapon. But to his surprise, Gerard again plunged his hand into the bag and pulled out his sword. The warriors were confused. How could such a huge sword fit into a small bag? Jumping off the cart, Gerard took a fighting stance, deciding it was time to run. Rushing forward, Gerard attacked Hwigaram, hoping that the heavy armor would slow him down. But to his surprise, Hwigaram easily parried the strike and Gerard had to retreat. Then, changing strategy, Gerard decided to test what the ordinary soldiers were capable of. After all, a commander remains a commander, and counting on an easy victory on his part was reckless. He attacked again, but this time at the last moment Gerard changed the blade's trajectory and attacked the soldier to the left of Hwigaram. What a shock Gerard experienced when the ordinary soldier blocked his strike just as easily, then delivered a sweeping blow which he barely dodged. Cursing, Gerard looked around. All without exception were clad in armor. It turned out escaping would be harder than he had thought, but surrendering was not in his rules. Raising his sword, Gerard launched an attack again against 3 opponents at once. Jinchon, who was watching the duel closely, noted that Gerard might be useful in the future. Uru, who was nearby and also observing the battle, agreed with him. Gerard's technique was indeed balanced, but it was not about technique at all, but about courage. Surely Gerard already understood that escaping would not be easy, yet his blade did not waver. The duel risked dragging on for a long time, as the warriors of Goguryeo could not fight at full strength without horses. Understanding this, Uru suggested sending a worthy swordsman to Gerard. He chose Kaverion as the candidate. Suddenly, Rizel approached them. He wanted to know what had happened in the rear and why there was a delay. Then Chuncheon explained to him that Gerard had managed to get out of the cage. The warriors had cornered him, but he was desperately trying to break through. Seizing the moment, Gerard managed to deflect the strike of all 3 soldiers and tried to attack Huigaram. At the last moment, he still managed to block the lunge and attempted a counterattack. But Gerard, grouping himself, avoided the blow, then did a backflip and retreated. Soldiers immediately rushed to him, intending to finish the duel. Of course, Gerard understood that his opponents were experienced fighters. It was felt in every one of their movements. The longer he dawdled with them, the more problems he would have. Then roaring, Gerard used mana, charged his sword with lightning and struck. Huigaram and the 3 soldiers managed to block the strike, but the lightning charge was so strong that it threw them back. Gerard was amazed because the warriors managed to block his sword without even charging the weapon with mana. Nevertheless, he was no longer going to conserve his strength. Finally realizing who was in front of him, Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise. After all, it was Gerard Thunder, ranked among the top 10 swordsmen on the continent, and the only swordmaster among the Free Knights. The soldiers tried to stop Gerard, but he scattered them like kittens, managed to knock one to the ground, and was already raising his sword to deliver a deadly blow. But an unexpected strike from the side, which Gerard still managed to block, pushed him back. He did not understand what was happening. How could someone stop his 2-handed sword? Before him appeared Kveron, introducing himself and wishing to fight Gerard one-on-one. Then Gerard summoned lightning again, but Kveron did not even raise an eyebrow, although the soldiers behind immediately grabbed their swords. Gerard was furious. Could the opponent not take him seriously? Anger gave him strength. The lightning covering his sword grew brighter, and the ground beneath his feet sank. Kveron was pleased. So this is the true aura of the sword. But Gerard did not understand what aura was being referred to. Nevertheless, Gerard was not going to dwell on this for long and immediately rushed into attack. Shifting his weight onto his left leg, Kveron prepared to attack. And when Gerard was already ready to strike, Kveron swung and made a counter-thrust. Miraculously, Gerard managed to fold and avoid the blow. Retreating, he tried to strike from behind, but Kveron managed to parry the thrust. Despite all the power Gerard possessed, the blow was so strong that it threw him backward. Kveron, however, did not move from his place. Smiling, he turned around. It seemed he was about to leave. Of course, Gerard immediately protested. What did this all mean? How dare the opponent ignore him when they had just begun the duel? But Kveron did not even think of retreating. Catching the sword and taking a combat stance, he began to concentrate. Gerard immediately felt changes in the air currents. Could it be that the enemy was going to use mana? Immediately raising his sword and summoning lightning again, Gerard prepared to attack. Suddenly the air around him seemed to freeze. A second later he was hit by a gust of wind. His sword broke in half, and a crash was heard behind him. Looking back, Gerard laughed hysterically. For several meters, the trees behind him had been cut down. Nevertheless, Gerard still expressed his respect for the opponent's skill. Kveron responded with mutual courtesy. Turning around, Gerard passed by Huigaram and the soldiers, cursing that this stunt had cost him too much. Passing by the cart with crushed armor, Gerard threw the remains of the sword there and returned back to the cage. Comfortably settled on the floor, he gave orders to move forward like a commander. But Jinchon was extremely displeased with the prisoner's behavior and ordered him to come out immediately. For the rest of the way, Gerard, cursing himself for his carelessness, ran behind tied to the cart. Under the cover of night, 3 soldiers carefully sneaked to the edge of the forest and began digging the ground with knives. One of them exclaimed joyfully and carefully pulled a small clay pot covered with cloth from the ground. Suddenly, a small shadow blocked the moonlight for the soldiers. Crying out in fear, the soldiers, without raising their heads, began to apologize. The soldiers already thought that the ugly business had been caught personally by Buru, which meant punishment was inevitable, but they were just taking leftover grain to make some alcohol. But righteous punishment did not follow. Then one of the soldiers took a risk and slowly raised his gaze. Instead of Buru, one of the stone brothers with a red beard named Galling looked at him in surprise. Taking a sip from this cup, Galling wiped his beard with his sleeve contentedly. The drink the soldiers offered him turned out to be not so bad. It resembled more of a stew, but it was quite easy to drink. The soldiers explained that they mistook Galling for Buru, which is why they were so frightened. Galling laughed good-naturedly. The soldiers were sneaking around so suspiciously that he and his comrades took them for enemies and decided to follow them. The soldiers still wanted to know if the local drink pleased Galling and his comrades. Of course, the drink was not bad, but after exchanging glances, the dwarves said in unison that they preferred beer more. The soldiers opened their mouths in surprise. They did not know what beer was, so they asked Galling to explain. The dwarves tried to explain as best they could, but the soldiers did not gain any clarity about the unknown drink. Then one of them sighed sadly and expressed a desire to try the strange drink someday. Galling immediately suggested to the soldiers to taste the beer. Since they were treated, they should also toast. Returning to the smithy and tasting the strange drink, the soldiers were impressed by its unparalleled taste. They had no doubt that the dwarves managed to brew such a delicacy, but they became curious about what exactly the beer was made from. Galling looked at the soldiers in surprise. The question seemed very simple to him, since everyone knows that beer is made from barley. Then it was the soldiers' turn to be surprised. Where did the dwarf get the barley? To which Galling, without hesitation, blurted out that they borrowed the barley from the warehouse. Before he could finish the sentence, Melvin and Trigon immediately shut his mouth. And then the soldiers realized why the porridge had stopped being served for several days. If the dwarves get caught, then they are all definitely doomed. This is not about collecting leftovers for cheap booze. This is serious. Nevertheless, Gallings assured the soldiers that he had everything under control. It's no coincidence that dwarves have a saying, caught means a crook, and if not, then a master. But as it turned out, Galling lacked the skill, and with a crash, the entrance door to the smithy flew to pieces, and Buru, clearly displeased, stormed inside. He heard every word perfectly, and now wished to bring punishment down on the heads of the guilty. The next morning, a trio of dwarves actively plowed the field allocated for barley. Buru, having taken a place on one of the towers, actively urged the guilty on. When night fell, the ghostly cavalry settled for a rest. In the center of the camp stood a large tent, which belonged to the great Sage. In the tent, Uru, Jinchon, and Rizel wanted to question the elf about how she ended up in such a deplorable condition. Rizel was the first to speak. Introducing himself, he greeted the child of the forest. The elf thanked them for the rescue and introduced herself in return. Her name was Hydia, and she belonged to the clan of the High Elves. Hearing this, Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise, because for ordinary elves, the High Elves were like supreme priests. So how did a High Elf end up captive to humans? Then Hydia told that their clan wandered between the settlements of their kin and blessed the newborns. During one of such journeys on the lands of Baron Elven, she was captured. The Baron's soldiers had a rare artifact, shackles that blocked mana, so Hydia could not escape. Rizel was extremely surprised at how Baron Elven planned to deal with the consequences of what he had done, since even ordinary elves knew that if you touch a high elf, you inevitably bring upon yourself terrible revenge. Suddenly, Uru, a little embarrassed, asked the old mage to lend him a communication ring, but Jinchon immediately protested. How he had the audacity to ask for such a valuable relic for personal needs. Uru immediately apologized, but then recalled that Jinchon himself had used the ring improperly. Suddenly, Hydia stood up from the chair and approached Uru. Touching his forehead with hers, she said, "Iluen hayon sharoyem dialadium." As soon as the words were spoken, the tent was illuminated by a bright light. Rizel and Jinchon watched the event attentively. When the light went out, Hydia bowed her head and greeted Uru, who to his surprise understood her perfectly. Then Jinchon decided to ask Rizel what was actually happening, how Uru was able to understand the elf's speech. In turn, Rizel tried to explain that the High Elves possess divine power that allows them to harmonize their speech with the language of the interlocutor. In a way, this could be called magic. Although Hydia said she belonged to the elf race, Uru still fell to his knees before her, continuing to consider her a fairy. Leaning down and looking into Uru's eyes, Hydia said she felt the mighty winds of the continent rushing over the land. Uru smiled joyfully. Could it be that Hydia was speaking about him now? She smiled in response and nodded affirmatively. Then Hydia looked at Rizel and asked him not to hurry, telling him that one day he would overcome obstacles on the path to enlightenment and achieve harmony with eternity. Bowing his head, Rizel thanked the elf for the guidance. Not fully understanding what was happening, Jinchon decided to ask what exactly Hydia was doing. To which Rizel replied that one of the features of the High Elves is the ability to see the essence of things. Kneeling down and looking into Hydia's eyes, Jinchon asked what she saw in his eyes. Hydia found it difficult to answer this question, for in Jinchon's eyes she saw only emptiness and nothing more. Hearing this, Uru burst into loud laughter. Could it be that Hydia wanted to say that their general's head was empty? But Uru did not laugh for long. Jinchon quickly reprimanded him, and then simply dragged the unconscious body out of the tent. The next day, the ghostly cavalry led by Jinchon had to cross a gorge. When they had already passed more than half the way, Suddenly, a command to stop was sounded. Ahead, their path was blocked by a whole horde of orcs. The leader of this pack of orcs was Bubakal, the son of the very Mukabil, who fell at the hands of the Goguryeo warriors. Uru immediately ordered the archers to fall back, and personally led the ghostly cavalry, which had advanced forward, to the left flank. Noticing this rearrangement, Bubakal immediately called the orcs to cluster together, but unlike Mukabil, who left passages for the enemy, Bubakal blocked all paths for the cavalry without exposing his warriors to fire, especially since this time there were only a dozen riders against them. Galloping at full speed, Uru did not understand at all what was happening and why the orcs had clustered together. Hydia, who was sitting behind Uru, noticed that a single cavalry unit could not break through such a dense formation of orcs. So why were the riders charging headlong instead of waiting for reinforcements? Having asked Hydia to hold the horse, Uru raised his bow and took aim. The riders behind him followed his example. Hydia was extremely amazed. Uru sat very confidently in the saddle despite having dropped the reins, for even elves did not achieve such unity with their mounts. Looking back, he asked Hydia to hold on tighter. She immediately pressed closer to him, and Uru himself smiled and fired. The shot was extremely accurate. The arrow hit the orc right between the eyes. Immediately after, the mounted riders fired volleys, each arrow hitting its target precisely. Hydia's astonishment knew no bounds. The arrows, released by the children of nature, were guided by the elements themselves, but in these arrows she did not feel even a trace of spirit power. Hydia also noticed that the technique of the Goguryeo warriors was different. Even at full gallop, their arrows flew faster than the elves. The orc formation collapsed. Monsters struck by arrows fell, trampling those who were still standing. Falling to the ground, Bubakal could not believe that humans were capable of shooting a bow at full gallop. Before Bubakal was forever buried under the bodies of his comrades, he saw his father's face one last time. Those who still managed to survive in this hell were immediately caught by the riders, leaving no chance for the orcs. But the most surprised by this battle tactic was Gerard, for he had never before seen heavy cavalry shoot bows while mounted. Even imperial knights were not capable of this. Finally, Gerard realized that all 150 Goguryeo warriors were knights, and each of them was at least equivalent to a son of the sword. Those who took the path of the sword began as squires, and then became skilled swordsmen. When they mastered the aura, they were called sword warriors, and then sons of the sword. The final level was the swordmaster. There were only 15 such people on the entire continent, including Gerard himself. That is why Gerard was so astonished, because even if you gathered all the sons of the sword on the continent, there would barely be 200 of them. Trailing behind the wagon, Gerard was lost in thought. The Laganza Mountains are one of the harshest places to live, so how could a whole state arise in such a wilderness? Not noticing that the wagon had stopped, Gerard, still immersed in his thoughts, painfully bumped into it. Rubbing the bruised spot, Gerard wanted to protest why they had stopped, but raising his gaze, Gerard opened his mouth in surprise. In the middle of the Laganza forest stood a fortress. A message about the arrival of the great Saji sounded, and the guards immediately opened the massive wooden gates. Entering the fortress grounds, Gerard was stunned. On both sides of the road for a long stretch stood soldiers fully clad in armor, as if they had come out to meet their leader. Buru bowed his head to greet Jinchon, who carefully inspected the surroundings and was pleased. Finally, this place began to look like a real village. Smiling quite a bit, Buru looked at the 3 dwarves behind him, whose appearance left much to be desired. Noticing the dwarves, Jinchon asked what had happened to them. But Buru assured that there was nothing to worry about. They just had to work a little on their upbringing. Finally, Buru noticed Gerard tied behind the cage and decided to inquire who this grimy ragamuffin was. Nodding at Gerard with a disapproving look, Jinchon explained that he was a tomb raider who also wielded a sword quite well. Buru's eyes widened in surprise. Could it be that he heard words of praise from the mouth of the greatest Saji himself? Approaching closer, Buru decided to find out the name of the one Jinchon praised so highly. Gerard introduced himself, but instead of a greeting, he received a blow right to the jaw. Not understanding what was happening at all, Gerard tried to retreat, but Buru skillfully tripped him and knocked him to the ground. Then he began mercilessly beating Gerard. The thing was that Buru did not hear the name clearly, and decided that the stranger called him a fatso, so he flared up. Rizal, who was watching what was happening, did not understand why Buru was so cruel, since Gerard had simply said his name. Jinchon, who was also observing, ordered Gerard to be hanged. Of course, Rizal tried to object, since Sir Gerard was a master swordsman. But Jinchon did not listen to him and simply left. At sunset, wandering around the fortress grounds among the still unfinished buildings, Rizal was attracted by a shout and swearing. Passing by the source of the noise, Rizal discovered Gerard, who was dangling upside down. Nearby was Jinchon. Despite Gerard's swearing and threats, the great Saja remained calm. Then he swung his sword. Rizel immediately shouted, trying to stop Jinchon. He wanted to know why the great Saja was acting this way. Jinchon stopped the sword a couple of centimeters from the prisoner's face, and then, without turning around, replied that Gerard needed to be finished off now, so as not to regret it in the future. Then Rizel tried to object. After all, Gerard Thunder was known on the continent, and his murder would have consequences. But Jinchon was not worried about the consequences, because he dragged Gerard into the fortress not to show off. As it turned out, Gerard refused to serve Jinchon, and the loser in battle has little choice: serve the victor or die. Until now, Jinchon had been dealing with Gerard only because he could enter the top 10 of his strongest warriors. But since Gerard refused, there was no need to be ceremonious anymore. Gerard immediately protested. He was one of the 15 swordmasters on the continent. It was foolish to think that among the warriors of Goguryeo there were 9 men stronger than him. In Jinchon's opinion, he was still too inexperienced, though talented. If Gerard still joined him, he would fully reveal his potential. Gerard could not tolerate such treatment. After all, he was a swordmaster, and they treated him like an object, better death. Then Jinchon, swinging his blade, with one movement cut the rope, and Gerard, swearing, fell to the ground. Then Jinchon raised the sword upwards, and it was enveloped by a column of colorless aura. Rizel even gasped in surprise. Jinchon was able to summon an invisible aura blade without any mana attribute. The color of the aura blade always depends on the owner's attribute. For example, Gerard's is milky white, but Jinchon's aura had no color at all. Just a shimmering transparent blade, almost 5 meters long. Gerard's 1 meter is nothing compared to that. Of course, Gerard was aware of the difference in strength, but he was still a knight. If Jinchon does not respect him, then at least let him not insult knightly honor. Hiding the sword in its sheath, Jinchon asked with contempt what exactly knightly honor is, which every knight shouts about in turn. Gerard was very surprised. Could it be that Jinchon does not know what it is? A knight is loyal to his lord and must protect the weak. In response, Jinchon only smiled maliciously. Is that all? A domestic dog is also loyal to its owner, and growls, protecting its puppies. By Gerard's logic, it turns out that a dog is also a knight. Gerard was about to object, but Jinchon, not waiting for an answer, turned around and ordered him to follow. Now Gerard would personally see what a true knight is. Jinchon, accompanied by Gerard and Rizel, approached the training ground where former plowmen were training with the warriors of Goguryeo. Pointing to the fighters on the ground, Jinchon said that these are the knights. But Gerard did not understand what he meant, as it looked more like a bunch of riffraff, but certainly not knights. The fighters, noticing that the great Saja himself had come to watch them, immediately straightened up and lined up in ranks awaiting orders. Pointing to the fighter in the first row, Jinchon asked why he was here, to which the former farmer answered without hesitation: to defeat his enemies and protect the country, because then he could save his family. Then Jinchon asked why the fighter should fight, since he could die in battle, but if he surrendered, both he and his family would survive. But the fighter replied that this was simply impossible, because then they would lose their will. Gerard was very impressed by such an answer. His abilities were so-so, but the boy had spirit. Nevertheless, anyone like that is trained at any knight academy. Of course, Jinchon agreed with him, but 3 months ago the people before them were simple farmers. If Gerard valued the empty title of knight so much, they would not keep it for him. But Jinchon asked him to remember one thing: everyone takes up the sword for one reason, and the title of knight does not make this reason special. The people before him took up the sword to defend the country they built. Whether to stay or leave could only be decided by Gerard, however. Jinchon warned him that if he did leave the fortress, there would be no mercy at their next meeting. The next day, Gerard, walking around the district, kept thinking about yesterday's events. Suddenly, Gerard's attention was caught by children who, to his surprise, were practicing archery. As it turned out, the soldiers gave the children bows, but Gerard could not understand why exactly they did this. The answer turned out to be simply that the children wanted to protect their mother. And according to the soldiers' assurances, one must know how to fight to live freely, as they do now. Seriously looking at the boy, Gerard was about to scold him, but suddenly Rizel called out to him. The old mage wanted to talk, so he suggested taking a walk. Leisurely strolling around the surroundings, Gerard suddenly asked where the warriors of Goguryeo originally came from. Rizel did not know the exact answer, but could only assume that they are people just like everyone else. Only their way of life differs. Then Gerard pondered. What about order? The nobility wields the pen and the sword to rule over the commoners. If the commoners master both, who will suppress the rebellion, and how will the nobility survive? Then Rizel explained that the Goguryeo Empire highly values strength, yet their thoughts are clear. When Rizal asked Chuncheon if he was not afraid of a rebellion by teaching commoners literacy and martial arts, Chuncheon only smiled in response, saying it is simply necessary to ensure that there is no rebellion. If people do not know why they take up the sword, then they will never see victory. If they do not know what they are protecting and what the victory is for, such a victory is worthless. Therefore, people must know and be wise so that the ruler does not make mistakes in the future. Gerard immediately protested. He could not understand what this even meant. But Rizal replied that these are merely the thoughts of the man he calls his lord. Rulers have duty and responsibility, and if they make fools of the people, it will lead to the ruin of the ruler and the country. After a few days, Chuncheon decided to inspect his possessions. Leisurely walking, he was immersed in thoughts about their future. Suddenly, Gerard appeared to meet him. After long deliberations, he still decided to accept Chuncheon's offer and stay. The great Saja was very pleased with such a decision. Nevertheless, Gerard wanted to know if it was true that Chuncheon would let him go if he decided to leave. Of course, Chuncheon would kill him in case of refusal. An ironic smile appeared on Gerard's face. Therefore, he decided to ask why then Chuncheon did not immediately tell him to choose between death and service. Why lie? The answer was quite simple. Chuncheon did not need cowards clinging to life. Now Gerard began to understand why Chuncheon demanded sincerity even from simple peasants. Nevertheless, he was curious to know how all this would end. Kneeling on one knee, Gerard Thunder, a free knight of the continent, swore loyalty to Chuncheon before the heavens. With respect, Chuncheon accepted his oath, asking to be killed if he strayed from the righteous path. Rising from his knees, Gerard departed. Unexpectedly, a vision of his near future appeared before him. He, clad in heavy armor, was at the head of a ghostly cavalry. Such a future pleased Gerard, and smiling he continued on his way. Watching the departing knight, Chuncheon exhaled with relief. Now, for some time, there was no need to worry about money, because now he had a specialist in dungeons with him. Standing on the pier, Chuncheon, gazing into the night sky, recalled the words of Rizal and Huigaram. There was no way back, and Chuncheon had to make a choice he believed he was not ready for. The next day, to the surprise of Huigaram and Mudon, the great Saja appeared in the meeting hall in full battle armor. Chuncheon ordered them to immediately gather all generals of adjutant rank and above and not to forget to call Rizal and Gerard. Not understanding what was happening and why they were summoned so urgently to the meeting hall, Rizal and Gerard ran at full speed. It was not worth angering the lord. Bursting into the meeting hall, they found an unusual scene. Chuncheon sat at the head of the table, and on both sides, in full armor, stood the generals and senior military ranks of Goguryeo. Rizal and Gerard were impressed. Even at the Imperial Council, one would not see such precise discipline. The generals looked like privates before their lord. Casting a glance over those present, Chuncheon asked if everyone was in place, to which Huigaram nodded affirmatively. Without unnecessary words, the servant brought out and placed a small wooden casket before Chuncheon. As soon as the great Saja slightly opened the casket, everyone in the hall felt a colossal surge of power. The generals immediately stood at attention. Gerard also felt the tension but, like Rizal, had no idea what was going on at all. Carefully taking the banner from the chest, which was the source of unimaginable power, Chuncheon descended and handed it to Huigaram. And while Huigaram was assembling the flagpole, Chuncheon addressed his people. Now they had nowhere to return to, and retreat was not an option. That is why Chuncheon made the difficult decision that here they would continue the history of Goguryeo. As soon as Huigaram hoisted the banner on the flagpole, the warriors immediately dropped to one knee as a sign of their loyalty to the empire. With their mouths open, Rizal and Gerard watched what was happening, wondering what this banner could mean. Carefully taking the flag from Huigaram's hands, Chuncheon headed for the exit. Without any words, the knights rose from their knees and followed their leader. Hydia, who was spending time in the forest thicket with its inhabitants, also felt a surge of energy. In strength, it resembled a dragon's aura, although Hydia was certain it was not hers. In the smithy, the old man Chan even stopped working when he saw the flow of energy coming from the meeting hall. He immediately jumped up and ran to the adjacent room. The dwarves were extremely puzzled as to why the work suddenly stopped, because if the metal cooled, it would have to be reheated. Galing was about to check what was happening, but suddenly Old Man Chan came out to them fully clad in armor, with a wooden case on his back. Then the dwarves asked again why he stopped the work, but Chan, without answering them, headed to the source of the energy. The dwarves exchanged glances and followed him. Chuncheon, with a banner in his hands, accompanied by the highest military command, entered the village. Seeing him, the men dressed in light armor, armed themselves, left their homes, and joined the procession. Climbing onto the wooden platform, Chuncheon struck the flagpole on the ground, and the soldiers immediately lined up, kneeling, awaiting the words of their lord. Then the great Saja spoke. He is the son of a concubine and a proud descendant of Yolja, promising to bring good to humanity. To those who disobey and go into betrayal, he will be merciless and will unleash upon them the iron hammer of justice. Under the banner of the three-legged crow, Jinchon, ascending the throne of Yolja, swore to the heavens to crush enemies with the iron hammer and be a shield for his people until the end of his life. An old man named Chang climbed onto the wooden platform. Kneeling on one knee, he handed Chunchon an open case. From the case, Chunchon took out the symbol of power in the Goguryeo Empire, an elegantly forged sword, which immediately became covered with a priceless aura. Raising the sword upward, Chunchon declared that the Goguryeo Empire will not be a country ruled by Yolja, but a country that Yolja protects. Generals, ordinary soldiers, and even the villagers burst into joyful exclamations. Hydia, who was watching everything from the side, stepped forward and knelt, which greatly surprised the nearby dwarves, because high elves do not bow their heads to anyone, not even to dragons. Kneeling down, Hydia thus expressed respect to the person who surpassed harmony itself and illuminated this world.
Soldiers celebrated under the night sky, shouting toasts for Goguryeo. The bright drink poured into cups amid the crackling of the bonfire. Leaders shared a moment of silence in the very center of the camp. Hot alcohol warmed bodies in the night chill. Ilchi smiled warmly, not letting the cup slip from his hands. The commander asked what made him change his decision. In response, only a calm smile and the flickers of the flame. The question hung in the air, leaving a slight surprise. The leader recalled the girl who grew up in this hell without love. The army tried to turn the wild lands into a semblance of home. The giants Baru and Uru were already competing to see who would drink more. The ruler admitted his goal was to protect the freedom of the new people. The envoy caught every word, not taking his eyes off the leader. Ruins appeared before his eyes. He could not let this power fade. Clenching the jug, he swore to protect what he had. The men drank to the loyalty that led them forward. Aside, the young Quarion watched the black flag. The red dragon on the cloth made his heart pound. Gerard's rough voice interrupted his thoughts. The youth responded with an insult. The giant instantly flared with rage at the boy's audacity. He demanded to stop childish whims and behave like a warrior. Quarion clenched his teeth, barely holding back an angry scream. The calm liar intervened in the conflict, jug in hand. The youth rushed to him, seeking refuge from the tyrant. He begged to be protected from this crazy shorty. The liar could not believe his own ears at such a comparison. Quarion poked a finger at the huge Gerard, calling him small. The situation turned absurd, making the liar nervous. The giant lectured that discipline is the only way for young men. Gerard's aura darkened, becoming truly terrifying. Quarion burst into hysterical laughter, feeling no danger. The liar froze in cold sweat, realizing the consequences. A giant shadow covered the brave one, making him pale. One short roar made the liar fall face first into the dirt. The young man understood. This evening would be his last. Both culprits slammed their heads into the ground under the executioner's watch. The punishment was severe, standing on their heads until dawn. Gerard left, leaving them in a humiliating pose in the middle of the camp. Quarion cursed fate while his companions sighed philosophically. The dawn painted the mountains in violet shades. While the camp slept, the two punished still kept their balance. Exhausted bodies finally collapsed to their knees under the watch of the liar. Quarion's attempt to cheat ended with another blow. His belongings scattered on the ground along with the hiking bag. The young man froze, weakly sprawled on the grass. A strong hand forced him to immediately get back on his feet. The friends barely formed ranks, miraculously surviving the night. The leader passed by, giving short orders to march. The liar received a strict order to immediately return to the post. One was sobbing from a fence. Another was crookedly smiling at his own foolishness. The ruler surveyed the possessions, dreaming of the greatness of Goguryeo. He explained the strategy to accumulate strength so as not to reveal himself prematurely. Quarion was amazed. The army already seemed invincible to him. The answer was firm. He was building an empire, not a sandcastle. The leader admitted the strength of the army alone would not be enough to hold the territories. Enemy reinforcements would easily crush their new conquests. Quarion did not understand why they distributed provisions to the beggars. The plan turned out to be cruel. The nobles would seize food by force, breeding rage. The young man began to realize the scale of this strategic game. The dark-haired man confirmed he acted preemptively, provoking chaos. Peasants who lost everything were destined to hate the kingdom forever. The crowds of the destitute would inevitably come to their true savior. Thus was laid the foundation for the future liberation army. Quarion shuddered at the realization of how cynical his leader was. He only smiled, skillfully playing the role of a benefactor. The silver-haired man pulled on a glove, preparing for new discoveries. His gaze became sharp and full of excitement. The ruler desired to uncover the secret hidden beyond the horizon. The sun flooded the walls of the magnificent kingdom of Haitian. The golden-haired knight confidently strode toward the heart of the palace. The guards froze, allowing the warrior into the throne room. The doors opened, revealing the path to supreme power. The guest knelt, demonstrating absolute submission. The knight's voice echoed under the vault, greeting the monarch. King Varakan looked exhausted from the burden of rule. The news was grim. Baron Elvin is dead, his lands plundered. An order arrived to immediately find the culprits in the Laganzi Mountains. Baron Levion accepted the mission with unwavering determination. In another part of the world, the Emperor in red awaited the report. The official began praising the ruler's greatness, losing himself in words. The monarch cut off the flow of flattery with a short and sharp gesture. He was interested only in facts and real threats to the state. The subordinate tried to justify the pathos with the new status of the Lord. Cries about the heavenly protector only intensified the tension. The emperor sighed wearily, enduring empty chatter. He demanded to discard feudal etiquette for the sake of faster decision-making. Every minute of greeting was stolen time from state affairs. The official was moved, impressed by the deep wisdom of the ruler. The servant fell prostrate, dramatically begging for punishment for his limitations. The ruler felt only irritation at this theatrical performance. An order arrived to immediately review the structure of the entire empire. Finally, they moved on to the real agenda. The official suddenly interrupted the silence again with a hysterical exclamation. The emperor's patience snapped. He instantly burst out shouting. The new problem concerned the title for the young Elucha. The subordinate insisted on the official recognition of the girl. The monarch froze. The child was barely 100 days old. Shock turned into outrage. She was just an infant in diapers. The prospect of marrying a child seemed to him a complete absurdity. The official's attempts to justify himself were instantly suppressed. The emperor was not going to waste years in cold solitude. The broken servant fell silent, realizing the depth of his mistake. The priority became the army and the law, not titles for infants. He put a firm end to it. The girl's fate now had no significance. The emperor in red ordered to think exclusively about survival. The youth in the golden crown laughed at his captain's old-fashionedness. The gray-haired general silently pondered, ignoring the carefree joke. Two figures froze in the night courtyard against the backdrop of the majestic citadel. The old man admitted, being a supporter of traditions is his direct duty. Life on the battlefield made their everyday life harsh and unusual. The young man squinted, acknowledging the value of the general's unconventional decisions. He preferred practicality, neglecting the empty formalities of the past. Only one question remained. What were all the previous objections for? The general explained, laws must evolve together with people. He half drew his sword, reminding of things that must remain unchanged. Cold steel flashed under the moonlight in a graceful movement. The weapon had been perfected over centuries, but retained its fundamental essence. Fire, hammer strikes, and sharpness are the foundation that cannot be changed. A lightning-fast swing cut through the air, instantly slicing the tall grass. A clean cut confirmed, sharpness is the only thing that makes a sword a sword. The general froze with the blade, urging to preserve the foundation despite any reforms. The steel reflected the moon, symbolizing harmony between the old and new worlds. The apprentice stiffened, finally grasping the full depth of the hard wisdom. He realized life in battles had made their perspective too one-sided. The old man sighed, acknowledging fatigue from every word of the great monarch. At that moment, the emperor himself sternly watched them from the shadow of the column. In memories, the order sounded, in 5 years, grant the title to little Ilcha. In the room, the general jumped in horror, not believing the heard decision. Political circumstances forced him to think about the concubine. The ruler closed his eyes, forever shutting this slippery topic. The old man bowed his head, acknowledging his helplessness before the will of the throne. Returning to reality, the young man firmly squeezed the mentor's hand. Loud laughter dispersed the nighttime tension and strengthened their alliance. The monarch's shadow did not take its eyes off this sincere handshake. The enraged ruler quickly walked away, syllabifying the general's name. The next day, the chiefs gathered due to a critical shortage of iron. All metal supplies went to endless wars and army equipment. The council proposed to buy back the resource as they had done before. The silver-haired one objected. Hyan took metal even from the poor. The bearded man did not understand why the mighty kingdom gave up position so easily. The young man pointed on the map. 3 empires were literally sucking the life out of the region. The emperor was angered that the people suffered because of foreign, senseless, internecine conflicts. A solution was found. The warriors discovered the perfect place for their own mine. A sharp cry of no instantly crossed out all the rosy plans. The monarch doubted they simply did not have free hands for such work. A representative of a low tribe offered help in exchange for resettlement. The emperor squinted, feeling that the price for the service would be too high. The tribe demanded secret forging, techniques, and control of the sacred fire. The settlement leader exploded with rage at such audacious impudence of the guests. He accused the foreigners of attempting to steal knowledge that belonged to the gods. Despite the shouts, the bearded men declared these lands a new territory of Goguryeo. The emperor put forward a harsh counter-condition: mandatory tax payment. The giant froze in shock, not expecting such a turn from an ordinary person. The giant instantly went on the offensive, smashing everything in his path in bloody fury. The strike cut through the silence, marking the beginning of a bloody fight. The giant knocked the opponent down with one devastating swing. The fierce bearded man roared, accusing the young men of ungrateful rebellion. The aggressive crowd surrounded the fallen warrior, preparing for a massacre. The emperor and his retinue found themselves in the center of a hostile circle. Despite the danger, the monarch maintained icy calm before the enemies. He confidently declared that the future mine would provide them with all resources. Old Rizal warned, ambitious dwarves would never agree to peace. The terrifying laughter of the leader drowned out pleas for mercy. Gerard felt the cold of death breathing down his neck. The emperor turned to the knight, preparing a special mission for him. In Gerard's eyes, hope for the long-awaited star time flared up. He fell to one knee, swearing to carry out any will of the ruler. The order sounded short and harsh: loot. The knight froze, not believing he heard that very word. The monarch specified the target: to intercept the iron that belonged to the empire. Shock turned into despair. The task seemed pure madness. Gerard did not understand where the ruler got this demonic confidence from. His patience snapped. He burst out shouting at the absurdity of what he heard. The knight mentally cursed fate, imagining himself as an ordinary bandit. The realization of the catastrophe overwhelmed him completely. He sprang to his feet, resolutely denying the possibility of such an operation. The emperor calmly explained, the metal is transported by sea through the ports of Haiyan. Gerard imagined an impregnable fleet guarding the precious cargo. In his thoughts, he was already fighting in a hopeless meat grinder on the city streets. His imagination painted a bloody clash on the pier against hundreds of enemies. The trap on board the ship looked like a death sentence to the cavalry. The finale was obvious: a shower of arrows and a shameful death on the deck. Returning to reality, the knight admitted this plan was suicidal. He was ready for piracy, but not for such a senseless slaughter. However, the monarch's gaze remained unmoved by any arguments. In his eyes was a will that could not be broken. The ruler confirmed the suspicion: they would become pirates. Gerard assured the narrow channels would never let the ships out to the ocean. Old Rizal confirmed the proximity of the sea, fueling the leader's interest. The plan was crazy: to drag the fleet overland by hauling. The knight protested again. There would not be enough manpower to hold the vessels. A sudden strike from Uru knocked Gerard off his feet, cutting through the air. The giant did not tolerate objections against the will of his great lord. He loomed over the frightened young man, demanding unquestioning obedience. The warrior's fury blazed. No one had the right to insult the Goguryeo fleet. Only a brief gesture from the emperor stopped the inevitable reprisal. Silence fell on the camp as the monarch pondered the next move. He admitted that there was a grain of common sense in the knight's words. Rizal agreed. The ships on land would simply topple under their own weight. The ruler smiled slyly. He knew much more about Goguryeo. The old sage froze in doubt, marveling at the leader's confidence. The order was unequivocal: to follow him immediately. A grand panorama of the hidden port opened before the group. Dozens of warships awaited the command of their great leader. The messenger ran along the pier, summoning the fleet command. The mighty warrior jumped onto the dock, ready to start the great game. The warrior fell to one knee, slicing through the air with a sharp movement. The black-bearded man began delivering a nauseating speech about the Lord of the Skies. The emperor interrupted this stream of flattery and surprise. He immediately suspected that behind these words stood the captain of the guard. The commander trembled confusedly, unable to justify his pathos. The monarch's irritation grew. The image of the self-satisfied captain was burning his brain. The ruler got down to business, officially addressing the fleet commander. While the workers were weaving nets, an order arrived: prepare the ships for the Great War. The sailor's face twisted in shock. He could not believe his own ears. The emperor responded briefly and confidently, leaving no room for doubt. The commander froze in awe before the grandeur of his leader. The silver-haired youth was amazed. The people believed the monarch even without a plan to go to sea. He skeptically assessed the chances of turning ordinary fishermen into killers. Having received the order, the warrior decisively headed to his men. A smile played on the ruler's lips while the companions watched the sailor's steps. On the shore, workers diligently prepared the gear, not noticing the commander's approach. A sinister shadow covered the men, forcing them to break away from work. Against the backdrop of the scorching sun, the commander snarled fiercely. His shout broke the silence. "We are returning to the sea!" The crowd froze, realizing the scale of the fateful order. Dead silence exploded into a wild roar. Hundreds of fists rose into the sky. The warriors celebrated the end of the lake exile and the return to the ocean. From afar, the monarch and the sage listened as the army chanted about future victories. The young man thought they were simple fishermen, but he was mistaken. The elder noted, behind the mass of the poor hid dangerous predators. The giant confirmed, these were true sea wolves, hardened by storms. The sage only sighed in awe, looking at the crowd's battle fervor. The giant anticipated large-scale battles and rivers of blood. Amid loud laughter, he called the commander back to the council. He quickly returned, ready for the final report. The brief report confirmed 6 ships were fully ready for battle. The fishing boats turned out to be the perfect weapon for the upcoming mission. The silver-haired man tried to grasp the strategy of using the strange fleet. The giant explained the essence. Flat-bottom ships would be the key to success. The young man asked skeptically, not understanding the advantage of such a construction. The elder warned, to move these machines overland, thousands of hands will be needed. The answer appeared by itself. The convoy was driving a crowd of fierce, bound orcs. Dozens of monsters obediently walked on a leash, held by several soldiers. However, the young man felt the approach of a real catastrophe. He shouted about madness. On this continent, demons were killed immediately. The emperor cut coldly. For him, they were just working cattle. The night froze from such icy and terrible pragmatism. The giant offered his method, to beat the monsters to near death. An evil smile twisted his face. A reason is not needed for a punch. He began to explain the obvious rules of raising monsters. The black-bearded warrior laid out his methods of upbringing, beat to near death. He smiled at the sky. The beatings guaranteed absolute discipline and survival. The advisor in green admitted the harsh truth, now only victory matters. Borden grinned fiercely, suggesting to nail a couple for better effect. His carefree laughter finally stunned the gray-haired advisors. The elders were pierced by cold sweat. They realized they themselves had almost become victims of these lessons. Later on the deck, the young man reported, "The plan with the orcs was good, but there were not enough working hands." The emperor watched the prisoners, understanding. They could not move 6 ships. General Buru noticed a strange silence. The monsters suddenly stopped attacking. The young man in the green cloak considered hunting orcs a dangerous folly. The attempt to dissuade the monarch ended with an instant curse from the enraged general. Tension among the leaders grew to the accompaniment of distant noise. A loud signal from the watchtower made everyone turn toward the fortress gate. The emperor from the balcony gazed at the horizon line, waiting for news. His gaze fell on a clearing sown with the corpses of green-skinned monsters. The soldier dropped to one knee, confirming the orcs had finally appeared. Puyogyul began the report on the clash near the citadel walls. The archers' arrows pierced the massive bodies of the monsters during the assault. Buru personally led the cavalry to clear the perimeter around the castle. The ruler looked at the dead bodies with disgust. He saw only lost labor force. The general listened tensely to the remarks of his dissatisfied lord. A shout of submission cut through the air. The order was accepted for execution. The guard's eyes widened from the sudden realization of danger. Buru bowed low, confirming readiness to correct the mistake. A squad of soldiers instantly rushed down the stairs to battle positions. Buru's cavalry swiftly galloped along the forest path, raising clouds of dust. Survivor civilians were hiding under the walls, trying to catch their breath from the horror. The general reported the successful rescue of people from pursuit. The emperor's face remained stone cold and unpleasantly cold. The old warrior did not understand the reason for his lord's dissatisfaction. He saw no point in capturing alive inedible and dangerous animals. The ruler's deep growl revealed his barely restrained anger. A sudden scream interrupted the heavy conversation. A rider galloped with a report. The messenger approached at full speed, shining with pride. The swordsman joyfully declared they had completely destroyed the orc squad. Baru froze. The soldier personally slaughtered those who were supposed to pull the fleet. The joyful report of no living enemies sounded like a death sentence. The heavy gaze of the monarch pressed the warrior to the ground more strongly than any burden. The swordsman's confidence vanished, giving way to an animalistic premonition of danger. The emperor's eerie smile made the soldiers shudder with horror. The advisors shook their heads in despair. They had already seen the end of this scene. General Baru closed his eyes, trying not to tear his subordinate apart on the spot. Panic gripped the warrior as the silence became absolutely unbearable. His face twisted with fear, and his voice turned into a croak. He sought salvation in the shadows of the columns, but he knew there was nowhere to run. The grim Baru and the executioner with the axe were already standing behind his back. The general began to whistle indifferently, preparing his special lesson for the poor fellow. The tired warrior leaned on his knee, wiping a sweat storm. He fled in panic, shouting about immediate disarmament. Under the clear sky, the official reported the arrival of the rescued peasants. Before the monarch stood the farmers who had barely escaped the monster's clutches. The people explained, usually the orcs retreated after the first thrashing. The emperor thoughtfully touched his face. The situation had become unusual. 4 months ago, the creatures suddenly went mad and multiplied their numbers. This term instantly caught the attention of the interested ruler. The advisor in the hat began searching for a connection between the dates and the chaos in the mountains. He asked Hawk about the number of hidden settlements in this region. The farmer uncertainly counted about 20 mountain villages. The strategist clarified whether they were all concentrated around water tributaries. The accurate guess shocked those present with its devastating precision. The advisor cut off a brief "understood," finally confirming his theory. The monarch demanded immediate explanations and the revelation of the enemy's movement secret. The map revealed the truth. Monsters and humans had maintained a fragile balance for centuries. The advisor clarified details about territorial feuds among the tribes from the sage. The strategic conclusion was laid on the table before the great emperor. The disappearance of one village provoked an orc invasion into neighboring territories. The creatures felt the power and no longer dared to engage in open clashes. The ruler agreed. The logic of his strategist was impeccable. The moment of the orcs' expulsion perfectly coincided with their appearance near the new borders. Besides monsters, the people were destroyed by the cruelty of the local Baron Elven. The number of orc refugees in the region rose to a critical level. The advisor confirmed the absolute accuracy of the imperial conclusions. A predatory fire flared in the monarch's eyes. He demanded exact coordinates. Intelligence has already established the location of each potential target. Old Rizal did not believe that such work could be done so quickly. He demanded explanations on how ordinary soldiers could become perfect spies. The warriors only smiled fiercely. They were a nation of born hunters. Annual tournaments turned every fighter into a master tracker. Rizal broke out in a cold sweat from the scale of the foreigner's militarism. The advisor immediately demanded figures regarding the full mobilization of the army. There were over 1,000 battle-hardened men at disposal. The cadre split, calm officials against fierce dogs of war. The sage was horrified. 800 were enough to destroy the Baron. Why more now? The advisor confirmed the total number of the strike group reached almost 1,200 fighters. The emperor rose from the throne, rustling in heavy imperial robes. He proclaimed the start of a great hunting tournament instead of the usual war. The condition was harsh, a generous reward for the largest number of live orcs. The hall erupted with animalistic delight and joyful cries of officials. The crowd turned into chaos of eager warriors thirsty for the promised victory. Only a youth in a green cloak tried to call for cold reason. He was horrified that the deadly mission in the Laganza forest had become a game for them. The aura of the soldiers darkened. They were already enjoying the upcoming bloody chase. The news of the competition instantly spread to the farthest corners of the palace. A fanatical fire flared up in the camp. The army was ready for the start of the great hunt. The camp trembled from screams. Recruits were preparing for sudden war. Exhausted soldiers whispered about fear before the first battle. Sweat blurred the eyes of those who held weapons for the first time. The officer assured the young man, this battle will be a rebirth for them. The emperor threw them into hell to burn out weakness. Fear in the eyes of the crowd changed to a predatory battle frenzy. Legions of warriors rushed forward, realizing their own strength. Thunder of war drums sounded over the fortress. The rhythm dun-dun struck straight into the hearts, preparing for slaughter. The commander on a black horse froze before the army. The horned helmet gleamed against the backdrop of an endless forest of spears. The massive Goguryeo army lined up in perfect ranks. Silence fell over the square as the leader opened his mouth. He coldly etched, "This is not a war." For a great nation, this battle was merely a hunting tournament. A thunderous voice asked if they were ready to become prey for the beasts. Thousands of throats responded with a single devoted roar. The commander incited the crowd, burning away the remnants of doubt. The categorical refusal of the army shook the very sky. The piercing eyes of the leader flashed from beneath the red visor. A deafening cry of "For the Emperor" tore through the air. He placed all responsibility for the soldiers' lives on the officers. The fanatical call was taken up by the commanders of the front lines. Steel slipped from the sheaths with a victorious chime. The bare sword pointed the way. "Let's catch the orcs." The army exploded with a predatory roar, thirsty for blood. The blond young man silently observed this madness. The human stream rushed past him, sweeping away everything in its path. The sticky fear of death gradually evaporated. The hearts of the warriors filled with an unrestrainable will to victory. A confident smile of a hunter played on the commander's face. The young man recalled the instruction, simply trust and follow. It was a demonstration of the true devastating power of Goguryeo. The commander pulled the reins, preparing the final throw. The massive gates of the fortress trembled at the order to advance. The tree shattered with a crash, releasing death outside. The commander flew first into the cloud of dust and uncertainty. The heavy cavalry surged after like an unstoppable force. Officers rushed into the attack with mad speed. The horde of orcs collided with reality, raising primitive clubs. Two armies crashed into each other in a brutal frontal clash. A gigantic monster swung for a devastating blow. The human sword instantly cut through enemy flesh, splattering everything with blood. The fallen creature collapsed dead on its own spears. The defenders clung to the palisade, holding back the onslaught of flesh. The old veteran shouted curses in the face of death. He pushed with all his might with a spear into the chest of the enraged beast. Horror and rage met in the final glance. A mighty lunge threw the soldier straight into the claws of the orcs. The young fighter shouted the name of the fallen comrade Milo with despair. The veteran's body was torn to pieces under the crunch of bones. The young man screamed in helplessness, covered in cold sweat. Shock paralyzed the will, but the battle demanded action. The commander's order pulled him out of hell. The breach had to be held. Endurance was the only chance to survive this slaughter. But the blue giant crashed into the barricade, shattering the logs to splinters. The defenders desperately held the barricade, choking in splashes of orc blood. The blue-haired youth screamed in horror, wiping the heavy sweat from his face. His partner panicked, shouting about a million-strong horde and immediate retreat to the tunnels. Escape was impossible. The monster's scent would catch them everywhere. The burly warrior's face twisted with utter despair and trembling. The strong man's nerves gave out. He pointed a finger toward inevitable death. From the height, the apocalypse opened up. An endless sea of muscles and fury stormed the walls. He hysterically demanded an answer. How a handful of people would stop this chaos. The young man was silent, only clenching his teeth to the point of bleeding, while dirt ran down his face. He mentally accepted death, preparing for his last battle. The partner continued to roar, trying to break through the wall of his fatal determination. On the wall sounded the last battle cry of those who were preparing to die. The squad rushed forward, cursing the enemy with every breath. Suddenly, a piercing "no" tore through the air. The line of defense collapsed. A giant orc with one wave of his hand scattered the fighters like dry leaves. A clawed paw intercepted the spear, and the beast's muzzle spread into a predatory smile. The blond soldier froze, paralyzed by animal terror before the predator. A devastating blow smashed his head, painting everything around red. Friends stared petrified at the massacre, accompanied by hysterical screams. The headless body fell into the mud, while monsters broke through the debris. The surviving soldiers helplessly raised their weapons against the steel onslaught. The blue-haired one strained his throat, trying to save the remnants of discipline. But Bell broke down. He fell, begging only for the right to live. The commander, in despair, tried to bring the boy to consciousness, but it was too late. Another warrior lowered his hands, awaiting a quick death from the punishers. The blonde sobbed on his knees before the enemy's shining eyes, even agreeing to slavery. The young man quietly exhaled yes, acknowledging the final defeat of the human spirit. Suddenly, the ground shook with the rhythmic thunder of hooves approaching from the fog. He whispered to his comrade that he had brought real devils upon them. Even the orcs froze, feeling the scorching earth vibrate beneath their feet. The sea of monsters began to look back, searching for the source of the unknown threat. The blue-haired one understood this was not ordinary help, but something much more terrifying. From the dust emerged cavalry in black armor, resembling ghosts more than anything else. The commander in the horned helmet raised his sword, giving the order to clear the area. The heavy cavalry crashed into the green mass, cutting through flesh at full gallop. The black riders swept everything away, trampling enemies under the hooves of mighty horses. One precise swing, and the head of a huge orc flew off its shoulders. A cloud of dust engulfed the battlefield, where the army literally ran over the horde. The perfect formation of Goguryeo advanced inexorably, like an iron wall. The vanguard leader proclaimed the start of a bloody hunt for boars. His eyes burned with fanaticism. He demanded death for every prisoner. The bloodied steel rose again with the order to kill as brutally as possible. Black riders drove the panicking beasts, cutting off heads amid their death screams. A black wave engulfed the fleeing horde, leaving behind a carpet of corpses. Invincible monsters now fled in terror from real predators. They whimpered in fear, vainly trying to escape death under the hooves. Suddenly, heavy infantry emerged from the dust, led by a giant axeman. He grinned fiercely, releasing a wild battle cry into the sky. Axes and shields completed the route started by the cavalry. Orcs fleeing from the horses fell straight into the iron trap of the infantry. Massive shields cracked the fangs and skulls of stunned monsters with a crunch. The army methodically crushed the crowd of enemies by all the rules of tactics. A vertical sword strike cut an orc in half, splattering everything with black blood. Halberds deeply tore flesh in this merciless tournament. The defenders did not understand why such a force was gathered for a simple mission. The blonde stammered in horror, expecting that these monster people would finish them off too. The blue-haired youth was lost in guesses. He had never seen such an army. A sharp scream made everyone duck. A massive shadow fell on the bridge. The shredded body of an orc, thrown by a blow, landed with a crash in front of them. The monster's torso torn in half put a bloody full stop to the demonstration of Goguryeo's power. A giant blue orc fell to the ground under a devastating blow. The defenders gripped their spears as the air was torn by the whistle of Goguryeo's maneuvers. The cavalry pierced the enemies, splattering everything around with black blood. The blue-haired youth froze. These people were exterminating monsters too easily. The fighter with the axe turned into a whirlwind, slicing flesh into pieces. The boy realized a real slaughter was unfolding before him. From above, the battlefield resembled a conveyor belt of death. Enemy heads flew in all directions. The commander radiated an aura of fear, coloring the world in bloody tones. Predators sweated with horror, feeling the breath of inevitable doom. The green-skinned ones dropped their weapons and fled in complete panic. But behind their backs, an iron wall of Imperial infantry had already risen. Witnesses could not believe their eyes. Orcs fled as if from real demons. The pierced monster spat blood in a death agony. The rule of the cornered rat did not work here. The hunters were not cats. Against the Goguryeo army, the orcs looked like pitiful victims before a tiger. The cornered game did not even think about resistance. The metallic clatter of armor signaled the start of the final phase. The order, forward, thundered over the field, cutting through the sky. The fanatical cry of the soldiers mixed with the enemy's death groans. The commander called to prepare for the next stage of the crazy plan. Iron scythes flew into the air with a whistle, covering the prey. Heavy nets turned the orc squad into a helpless pile of meat. The bearded archer drew the bowstring, anticipating bloody excitement. A volley of arrows with a piercing hum fell on the targets. The arrowheads sank into bodies, making the monsters howl in pain. The general went mad from a headshot, while he demanded only anesthesia. The order was clear: aim only at the butts to paralyze, not to kill. A rain of arrows again covered the field under the coordinated hoofbeats. This time the strikes were precise. The orcs comically shuddered from the stings. The commander lectured, "To earn the rank of a man, one must be able to calculate strength." The infantry instantly confirmed the order with a single steel shout. Mastery required a cool head and perfect calculation. One precise move, and the general demonstrated a jeweler's shot. His loud laughter marked the success of the improvised anesthetic. He watched as his men easily drove the immobilized beasts. The officer gave the order to begin the mass capture of prisoners. The warriors threw off the light fabric, preparing the secret weapon for action. The general boasted he was the only one who really used his brains. The cover fell, raising a cloud of dust over the contents of the cart. Work was boiling on the shore. The fleet was preparing nets for a big catch. The commander grimly assessed the speed of the warship's preparation. The enraged officer cut off any attempts to cool off on the pier. He demanded an immediate report on why the weaving of the fishing gear was progressing so slowly. A gigantic net covered the sunny sky, falling on the doomed orcs. The monsters screamed in the trap while the soldiers tightly tightened the knots. The fishing gear turned out to be much more effective than the expensive iron snares. Commander Chan saw no difference between catching fish and capturing pigs. He clenched the axe. The time for the final reckoning had come. "Let's start the harvest." The cry rang out over the bewildered victim. A blow with the flat side of the axe raised a wave of blood and dust. The soldiers fanatically took up the clubs, methodically beating the prisoners. The execution turned into a routine and terrible job. The clubs relentlessly fell on the bodies, leaving no chance for resistance. The recruit was gasping in horror, seeing such inhuman cruelty. Friends trembled. They feared they would become the next victims of these people. The young man closed his eyes, praying for a quick death in this hell. Soldiers fought to drag nets with frenzied orcs. The silhouette of the ruler on horseback froze against the crimson sky. The generals reported the successful completion of another catch. The emperor, through the visor, authoritatively called Uru. The general responded instantly, losing his words from fear. The ruler coldly inquired whether he intended to personally drag the captives. He was infuriated by the sight of fainted freaks who had turned into ballast. Uru was covered in cold sweat, not knowing how to justify the failure. A harsh order arrived to take the captives, as it was the general's duty. While Uru begged for mercy, his comrade mocked his ineptitude. The monarch's gaze stopped on Baru, whose excitement instantly faded. Attention was drawn to the torn ropes lying under the hooves. The emperor cut in. Nets are needed for fish, not for giant pigs. The punishment was swift. The squad was left without food until the gear was restored. Baru screamed in despair, but it was too late. The commander galloped away in the rays of the setting sun. A vein on the ruler's forehead pulsed with irritation at the stupidity of his subordinates. The endless army of Goguryeo grew before the walls of the unfamiliar fortress. The guards waited in panic for the enemy's punitive squad. The defenders trembled, peeking out from behind wooden stakes. The ranks of infantry marched in perfect sync, demonstrating steel will. The leader rode forward through the formation, which respectfully parted. Commander of the fortress, Million Sailor flinched at the scale of the threat. The clatter of heavy armor approached the walls inexorably. The emperor's formidable gaze radiated icy cold. The vanguard stopped before the gate, raising clouds of dust. The officer authoritatively demanded the exit of the one who holds power here. Peasants and guards found themselves face to face with their own death. Million Sailor stepped forward, overcoming paralysis. He officially announced his name as the commander of the fortress. His voice trembled, but the warrior held the spear to the last. The emperor repeated his name as if tasting it. The answer was brief. He came to capture this place. A wave of panic swept over the crowd of civilians behind the walls. Million admitted powerlessness. Such an army could have wiped them to dust. Despite the horror, he dared to ask the last question. The voice shouted into the sky, "Whose army is this, and who stands behind it?" A barely noticeable predator's smile appeared on the ruler's lips. The blue flag of Goguryeo spread its wings over the battlefield. The monarch's voice proclaimed the name of the great empire. Thousands of spears soared upward under the fiery roar of the troops. The psychological pressure became unbearable for the handful of defenders. The last hope faded in the eyes of the destitute people. The ruler's fist made the multi-thousand crowd instantly fall silent. He offered Million the path of the warrior and the true science of battle. The defender was outraged, seeing no difference between himself and the tyrant nobles. The pain of slavery forced the mercenary to seek only illusory freedom. Bloody scenes of endless, internecine wars appeared before his eyes. In memories, the cynical meat grinder appeared again, where only the rich survived. Aristocrats smiled while ordinary soldiers died for their whims. The emperor listened to this monologue without removing the mask of severity. For Million, any ruler was only the master of a new whip. The monarch's eye flashed. He sharply denied this despair. He swore at the cost of battles, their families would gain eternal peace. Million received the right of choice on which everything depended. The peasants froze between promised freedom and usual death. The weight of this moment made the fortress commander hold his breath. The final promise was honest. Those who remained would not be touched by the army. Million begged for time, squeezing the fence wood until it cracked. The commander and the horned helmet cut off. They had exactly 1 hour left. The heavy cavalry turned around, leaving the defenders in a cloud of dust. An order came to take the perimeter and prepare to rest. The mercenary needed only a glance to understand. He had never seen such an army. The black eyes and pale skin of the warriors made them strangers on this continent. No country in the world forged armor for riders, but Goguryeo did. Million imagined how the steel horse crushed an orc with a single hoof strike. A shadow of doubt fell on the veteran's face as the monsters died in his memory. The voice of young Nell pulled him out of heavy thoughts. The boy trembled, not understanding how to act in this hopeless situation. He reminded Million of his glorious past during the Imperial War. The veteran's profile darkened under the burden of responsibility for the peasants' lives. Nell compared the strangers to a Mary's infantry, considered the strongest in the world. Rows of iron knights appeared before his eyes, but the answer was bitter. Million cut off. This is not the Empire. This is something much more terrible. He clenched the spear, realizing the illogicality of the unknown enemy's demands. No country had any reason to go so far for a handful of poor people. Suddenly, the shout of a familiar name made the mercenary's heart tighten. From the field to the barricades ran Veron and Hawk, survivors of the bloody slaughter. Million could not believe his eyes, demanding explanations for their appearance. There was only one question. Who were these heavily armed people behind them? Veron smiled. They were old friends from his hunting days. The mustached peasant looked at the newcomers with distrust, expecting a trick. Nell demanded the truth about where this mighty military machine came from. The formation of warriors stood firm, having nothing in common with the high-end guard. Veron announced the cruel news. The old army no longer existed. He proclaimed that this new force had become their true salvation. The peasants' faces stretched in complete and silent shock. The story began at the moment when they sought protection from mercenaries. But the defenders betrayed them, trying to sell them to Baron Elven. The bandits were already dragging children into slavery when hope finally faded. Then punishment fell from the sky. Unknown warriors smashed the traitors' heads. The baby hugged the warrior who brought them freedom with tears of gratitude. Commander Koguryo showed mercy, allowing the poor to remain alive. The crowd erupted with joy, believing in the promised safety under the new banner. But Hawk interrupted the festivities. 7 families of their village indeed became slaves. Joy instantly turned into animal terror and complete stupor. Million demanded explanations. Koguryo did not promise life in chains. Veron explained, freedom in this empire is bought only with one's own blood. A hand on the sword's hilt emphasized the law. The right to life is not given for free. He raised the steel to the sky, calling everyone to take up arms. Million paled. The idea of turning plowmen into killers seemed madness. The philosophy was simple. If you want to be free, fight and win. Every person had to become a brick in the foundation of a new unbreakable nation. The courage to sacrifice life for oneself. That was what they were taught. Veron summarized, that is why the mercenary had to firmly hold his sword. Million looked at the spear, seeing in the peasant's armament only certain suicide. He remembered how he fought for gold, never seeking a higher purpose in war. The mustached peasant stared in horror at the crimson horizon of an unknown land. Veron and Hawk answered proudly, this is the place where everyone was handed death. The light-haired warrior confirmed, they are near the central lake in the Legenzi Mountains. The peasants froze in silent shock before the grandeur of the legendary reservoir. Veron tightly gripped the spear. Proximity to the monster breeding ground promised nothing good. His confidence was frightening. He spoke of the impossible as if it were everyday life. A sharp strike of the spear shaft on the ground put an end to it. The decision was up to the mercenaries. A heavy pause hung in the air, broken only by the warriors' heavy breathing. The warning was harsh. The monsters had begun migration, and the village was once again under threat. 2 fighters disappeared into the glare of the crimson sunset, leaving the people alone with their choice. Varen's figure radiated unwavering faith amid the confused crowd. The peasants saw him off with distrustful glances, refusing to accept the truth. He understood. People were simply closing their eyes to the obvious demise. Fear of change proved stronger than the instinct of self-preservation. A steel wall of the Imperial Army lined up before the walls. The commander in the horned helmet cut short, "I am returning." The officers instantly turned their riders, obeying the will of the leader. A desperate cry of "Wait!" forced the war machine to halt. The crowd raged, accusing millions of betrayal and kidnapping people. Varen responded with a fierce cry. He chose life, not slow death. He sought freedom for the children so that they would forget the eternal struggle for survival. Millions froze, struck by the depth and determination of his comrades' words. Two warriors exchanged respectful bows under the bloody sky. The first volunteers followed the army, leaving the past in the dust. A million silently saw off those who dared to go into the unknown. Varen confidently led the people straight to the Black Riders of Goguryeo. The commander, from the height of his steed, officially named the name of the million sailor. From now on, the mercenary was responsible for every soul that joined the empire. The shocked warrior instantly pulled himself together, obeying the new order. The emperor authoritatively called Gerard, and he responded with a steel yes. The young man could not believe that such an important mission was entrusted to him. The icy gaze of the monarch cut off any doubts and unnecessary questions. Gerard shuddered, feeling the absolute power in the silence of his lord. He sharply turned around, ready to immediately carry out the will of the empire. Varen froze, hearing the true name of the savior, the great emperor of Goguryeo. The ruler towered over the crowd, demonstrating his unwavering grandeur. The peasants froze in reverence before the true monarchical power. The cavalry regrouped. The brutal hunt for the Orcs was just beginning. General Buru dared to ask why they should protect these miserable people. The monarch's anger was immediate. He silenced his subordinate with a single question. The warrior admitted, without their help, the defenders were doomed to a painful death. To the question about mercy came a harsh answer. No. The general was confused, not understanding the true intent of his lord. The plan was diabolical, to let the Orcs attack again and take the survivors into slavery. The terrible plan of the monarch finally reached the consciousness of the commander. Everyone who refused freedom today will pay for life with chains tomorrow. Buru saluted, captivated by the ruthless political genius of the leader. Gerard realized the power of the army was based on this bloody pragmatism. The calm voice of the emperor pulled the young man out of captivity of thoughts. The order was clear. Immediately arm every village boy. Officer Kavi received the directive to set up a camp for training recruits. The command "halt" rang out over the field under the pink-purple sky. Thousands of voices merged into a single yes, confirming steel discipline. And in the shadow of the cage, someone doomedly cursed this cruel world and its masters. The warrior pushed away the green orc, pouring out rage in a short scream. His face was drenched in sweat. Every breath came with pain. Near the dark cage, the guards froze, waiting for Captain Guillaume. In the middle of the squad lay a gnawed skeleton. The monsters began to devour their own. The shocked guards ordered not to take their eyes off the cannibals. General Buru arrived in a cloud of dust, demanding a report on the noise. Guillaume met the commander, preparing him for the grim news. The terrible truth cut through the silence. The Orcs had turned to eating the flesh of their comrades. Buru froze, not believing his own ears at what he heard. The men looked at the bones, realizing the true nature of the beasts. The general pondered, weighing the consequences of this revelation. Suddenly his face was lit up by a cynical idea. He decided that cannibalism was the perfect solution to the food problem. The captain was stunned by the proposal to feed the slaves with their own relatives. Guillaume feared that such a diet crossed the line, even for monsters. Buru passed by a corpse, acknowledging the inevitable cruelty of the world. He lifted a skull, proving that death on the job was no better than eating. The captain tried to argue, but the general silenced him with a single glance. The boundary of morality disappeared when one beast decided to devour another. The young man looked confusedly at the mentor, shuddering at his logic. Buru ironically reminded about the rumors that these monsters could talk. He mocked the idea of the beast's intelligence, which had no human traits. The captain fell silent, oppressed by the commander's iron arguments. The skull appeared before Guillaume's eyes as proof of the orc's animal nature. A rational being would not eat a comrade over one missed meal. Guillaume admitted the monster's behavior had nothing to do with human logic. Cannibalism proved they always lived by the laws of a wild pack. The captain finally grasped the terrible truth of his mentor's words. The skull flew into a pile of bones, putting an end to this dispute. The general asked what kind of monsters people themselves seemed to their slaves. He advised not to measure another's nature by human standards. Life demanded sacrifices, and the food shortage dictated its own rules. The army simply adapted to the natural order of beasts. Satisfied with the speech, Buru sent the subordinate back to the ranks. The creak of the gate marked the end of the difficult conversation. Gil was left alone with doubts that tore his soul apart. Every word of the mentor seemed logical but deeply wrong. Buru walked away, proud of his own persuasiveness. An endless steel wave of troops was forming on the plain. The ruler in the horned helmet demanded a report on readiness. The generals swore allegiance, ready to carry out any will. The emperor ordered Gerard to train the youth away from real blood. The knight accepted the task, becoming a shield for the future generation. The monarch cared about the comfort of families, so that the recruits would fight more fiercely. The generals received orders to instill divine awe in the hearts of their subordinates. In case of failure, the command came, only the complete annihilation of the enemy. Kvigaram dared to interrupt the march with his remark. The emperor stopped his horse, waiting for the officer's report. The shortage of labor threatened the transportation of the fleet. Other commanders supported concerns about logistical hell. The monarch remembered the 20 boars devoured by their own pack. Uru trembled, trying to justify the hunger of the monsters. Buru, however, did not lose a single slave, which only fueled the ruler's anger. Uru bowed his head in shame, feeling the gloating of his comrades. The emperor calmly moved on to solving the problem. He proposed a cynical solution, to start independent breeding of orcs. The warriors were stunned by the madness they heard. The emperor voiced a cynical plan to breed orcs like livestock for labor. The soldiers timidly objected, pitying the young offspring of the monsters. Under the icy gaze of the monarch, the guard instantly submitted to the order. The commander asked how exactly to organize this wild farm. The answer was cold, aphrodisiacs and common pens. The plan was accepted without unnecessary words. The ruler gave the order to advance immediately. The heavy cavalry rushed forward, raising clouds of dust. The Goguryeo army crashed into the horde, breaking through the barricades. The green-skinned monsters rushed forward in bestial fury. The orcs slammed the warrior into the wall, shattering the wood into splinters. The giant loomed over the blonde fighter, preparing a deadly strike. Lightning-fast steel sliced the creature's snout. Black blood flooded the ground. The Goguryeo riders galloped through the meat grinder, not stopping for a moment. The cavalry mercilessly crushed the enemies, pressing them into the mud. The steel steeds turned the orcs into a bloody mess. The narrator recorded, villages fell one after another, the number of captives multiplied. The new citizens fought fiercely, shoulder to shoulder with the regular army. Former farmers rapidly mastered the art of professional killing. Those who refused citizenship felt the weight of the shackles. A column of 10,000 souls stretched to the very horizon. The emperor watched his growing power against the backdrop of eternal mountains. Goguryeo transformed into a mighty state with a population of 14,000. The sky cleared, granting a brief pause after the great massacre. Knights in blue cloaks rode into the ancient city of Haiyan. The townspeople fell prostrate, frozen with fear before the authority. The red-haired Baron of Highland confidently rode through the submissive crowd. Rumors circulated that he hunted those who helped the poor with grain. Frightened glances saw off the riders in oppressive silence. The people knew this visit would only complicate their already hard life. The White Palace shone in the rays of the setting sun. The Baron demanded new taxes, soldiers, and young maidservants. His gaze radiated only cold and boundless superiority. The next order was the urgent summoning of all the city's merchants. The officer obediently accepted the orders of his lord. The leader headed to the main gates alone. He despised daredevils who became food for monsters in the mountains. He was interested only in abandoned houses and the gold of future dead. The Baron decided to personally study the situation in the mountainous region of Laganzi. From the shadow of the columns, a mysterious spy watched him relentlessly. In another fortress, Rizel swore allegiance to the emperor. The monarch demanded complete information about the ancient kingdom of Haiyan. The elder bent over the scrolls, preparing to reveal forgotten secrets. Haiyan turned out to be the cradle of the world with an 8,000-year history. The ruler was astonished at how such a mighty land could have turned into ruins. Books about those times were found to be forbidden under the threat of death. Legends spoke of gods who descended to the center of the world. Laganza. It was there that the first human civilizations were founded. History reminded the emperor of his native myth about the founding of Pekdal. The question about the true reason for the prohibition of chronicles hung in the air. The Hanazia Empire simply wiped out competitors to rule over memory forever. The ruler felt disgust at such a low and vile political game. Rizal concluded, world history was held together by the great lie of powerful empires. Bloody battles for centuries turned Haydn into a graveyard of empires. The elder recalled two great wars that tore these lands to pieces. Hanazia and Slagia took turns strangling the land with endless occupation. The young ruler admitted their freedom was only a temporary agreement of enemies. He unrolled the scroll, revealing a detailed strategic map of the continent. The advisor fell silent. The monarch had personally drawn all the borders and troop positions. The map in trembling hands seemed like a true priceless treasure. The elder suspected theft by Gerard, imagining his desperate tears. A commanding gesture pointed to Haydn. The ruler demanded a full analysis. The sage's finger stopped at a key point on the ancient parchment. The country was squeezed by three empires, doomed to eternal pressure. But south of the mountains, entry was strictly forbidden, even to the strongest. The youth's gaze narrowed. He demanded to know the reason for this barrier. Thousands of dragons ruled there, intolerant of human presence. The monarch coldly received the information about the deadly dragon forest. The elder quietly confirmed, the lizards did not forgive invasions. Then the ruler's hand confidently rested on the map. This is our land. The advisor could not believe his own ears at such a crazy plan. He begged to come to his senses. The lizard's lairs were pure suicide. The young man asked, if the pact exists, why does the people still pay tribute in blood? The money turned out to be a legal way to rob the land without full occupation. 3 regions were handed over to the enemies for slaughter through a system of concessions. The ruler's anger flared. Haydn simply tolerated this humiliation. The nobles profited from trade while the country became a thoroughfare. The elder painfully admitted honor was sold for gold. It became clear. Baron Elvin came only for the final plundering of the peasants. A grim confirmation recorded this bitter truth. The monarch stated, the power betrayed the people, turning the country into rot. The verdict was engraved on the map. The nobility completely forgot their duty. Work was boiling at the pier under the supervision of heavy warships. The ruler demanded a report on the fleet's readiness for the great sortie. Buru continued breeding orcs, but there was still a lack of forces for the army. The monarch noticed a suspicious joy on Gerard's face. He sarcastically assured that he was only deeply saddened by the delay. The young man hurried to distract the master with a new development by Master Chan. The ruler agreed, giving Gerard a chance to avoid questioning. The master proudly presented a massive ballista for the fortress defense. The machine fired 200 arrows or spears in one devastating volley. A distance of 1,000 miles amazed even the unflinching monarch. But charging such a giant required superhuman physical strength. The engineers found a replacement for the oxen, which intrigued the ruler. The old master was preparing to reveal his main tactical trump card. He assured young specimens are ideal slaves, easy to tame. Working with the smaller ones was simpler, and the monarch silently nodded. An order was given to immediately demonstrate the ballista in real combat. Chan Mu received the leader's directive in a military manner. The operators froze, awaiting the command for the first volley. The soldiers watched as young orcs dragged the heavy mechanism to the ballista. For the promised meat, the beast joyfully clung to the wooden levers. The command hold cut through the air. The orcs began to draw the bowstring. With heavy hacking, the monsters pushed the beam, overcoming the resistance of the wood. The rope creaked as it wound onto the spool, accumulating deadly force. Sweat drenched the backs of the orcs while the mechanism cracked under tension. A metallic click securely fixed the taut steel. The officer gave a loud order to load the weapons immediately. The bearded one skillfully installed the box filled with dozens of sharp arrows. The fastening locked. The system was fully ready for killing. The gray-haired warrior shouted the order to open fire. The crowd picked up the call, demanding an immediate volley. A devastating hammer strike on the firing mechanism raised a cloud of dust. The ballista shuddered from the recoil, spitting death into the sky. A deadly swarm darkened the sun, slicing the air with a steel whistle. A hail of arrows with a dull crack pierced the trunk of the giant tree. The emperor and the retinue were stunned by the destructive power of the new development. An order was given to place the installations along all the fortress walls. The ruler inquired about the name of the weapon, but it had not yet been chosen. The strong man proposed the name Orc, based on the amount of draft power. A sudden blow to the jaw instantly ended this flight of fantasy. The attacker angrily argued the absurdity of such primitive logic. The beaten bearded man only stared wide-eyed, not understanding the reason for the anger. A fierce quarrel with insults and threats broke out among the warriors. Noticing the monarch's gaze, the duelists resignedly bowed in obeisance. The ruler ignored the noise and began to pronounce the future name. He combined the hieroglyphs of youth and boar into one symbol. The final touch added the very concept of ballistics to the name. In the beams of light, the emperor solemnly proclaimed the name, Udano. An oppressive silence fell around. The name seemed too strange. Only one young man barely restrained his laughter, covering his mouth with his hand. He instantly caught the ironic coincidence with the foreign phrase, "You don't know." The boy hummed the new name of the weapon, enjoying the secret joke. The bearded man suspiciously asked if his tongue was getting tangled. In response, the young man shouted, "Shut up!" shocking the naive warrior. He lied that it was a Western call to cheer up and smile. The bearded man's anger instantly changed to childlike curiosity. The young man continued the provocation, while the giant clenched his fists in excitement. Both laughed, exchanging insults that sounded like greetings. Deceived warrior ran on errands, dancing with joy. The young man remained alone with his triumph, savoring the perfect moment. In the throne hall, the young man reported to the ruler and the numerous retinue. He reported on the successful relocation of all Udano systems. Suddenly, the hall was pierced by a cheerful shout of "Shut up!" causing the boy to turn pale. The same bearded man shone with pride, demonstrating his knowledge. The giant stood confidently before the throne, while the joker dripped cold sweat. He explained to the monarch that this was a sacred call to cheerfulness from distant islands. The climax of horror came when the warrior shouted, "Shut up!" right in the emperor's face. Panic seized the young man. The ruler's face turned into a stone mask of rage. The monarch's teeth grinding foretold a swift and painful punishment. In an attempt to save himself, the boy shouted a complete absurdity, mixing the name of a weapon and foreign profanity. Borodin rejoiced in his new strength, while the young man silently restrained his rage to avoid exploding prematurely. The boy triumphantly raised his fist, confirming his triumph under the clear sky. He closed his eyes, releasing steam so as not to burn out from inner anger. Panic overwhelmed him when a mysterious blue ring flashed in the massive hand. The general curiously twisted the ornament before the throne, not understanding its value. The blue stone tightly gripped the thick finger of the warrior. Tension soared to the limit. One was drenched in sweat, the other gloomily studied the artifact. A sinister whisper, "You do not know," sounded like a death sentence. The general's gaze became devastating, and his voice much more confident. The silence was shattered by a deafening scream, "Shut up! Shut up!" The boy nervously smiled, trying timidly to calm the enraged beast. The psychological pressure became unbearable. He fled past the guards. The escape was cut short instantly. A mighty hand grabbed the fugitive's hair. A devastating kick threw the young man back, knocking the last breath out of him. The general's fist was already raised for the final blow. The doors opened. Scouts brought news about Elven's squad. The fallen victim screamed painfully under the weight of the enraged commander. Buru promised to deal with him later, turning his attention to the messengers. The envoys hurried toward the throne across the entire hall. The guards fell to their knees, reporting the arrival of Baron Levian. The army of knights was already advancing toward the lake shores under the pouring rain. The general thirsted for blood, demanding 100 fighters for an instant slaughter. The advisor in the hat stopped this senseless impulse just in time. He calculated every step. The enemies were looking for the cause of Elven's death. The death of the investigators could have brought upon them the full might of the kingdom of Hyen. Buru froze, not believing that the empire was forced to act so cautiously. Cold sweat blurred the eyes of the warriors before the threat of a large-scale war. The desperate shout of the general cut through the silence of the throne room. The emperor admitted they had seriously underestimated Hyen's vigilance. The lake was the heart of their country. They could not abandon it. The decision was made to stay and erase all traces of their presence. A heavy silence covered those present in anticipation of further instructions. The advisor stepped forward, preparing his strategic move. The monarch waited with interest for the unveiling of the new plan. The trick was in using the features of the local landscape. The column of Baron Levian's heavy cavalry silently advanced through the downpour. Scouts in blue cloaks cautiously studied the night thickets. One of them froze, hearing a suspicious rustle in the bushes. The partner made the squad hold their breath in complete silence. Loaded crossbows were aimed at every shadow around, but only a wounded, timid deer peeked out from the thickets. The soldiers relaxed, seeing no danger in the animal. The warriors decided to catch the beast to make a gift for their lord. The deer's movements were heavy and full of pain. A joyful exclamation confirmed the guess. The animal's leg was broken. At that moment, an orc's snout with a bloody smile emerged from the darkness. A mighty club smashed the scout, pressing him into the ground. A pack of monsters burst out with a roar, rushing at the bewildered people. The Baron sensed danger and sharply stopped his warhorse. The order, halt, instantly spread through the column. The infantry turned pale. The forest teemed with enraged orcs. The riders grabbed their weapons, not understanding the reason for the attack. The path, considered safe, turned into a deadly trap. Baron Levion shouted curses under the downpour, pressing his sword to the guide's neck. He promised to feed the peasant to the beast if the squad fell into the trap. Sensing the threat, the leader ordered the infantry to immediately close the flanks. The steel-clad soldiers moved in unison into formation under the roar of the rain. The army formed an iron semicircle, hiding crossbowmen behind shields. From the thicket came the ominous rustle of the approaching enemy. Levion ordered to prepare arrows while the infantry braced against the wet ground. Crossbowmen froze, aiming into the darkness of the forest. An enraged horde of orcs burst out of the thickets with a wild roar. A volley of bolts cut through the rain curtain, piercing the monster's skin. Spearmen prepared to receive the devastating blow of the crowd. The battle flared up instantly. Steel pierced bodies, splattering everything with blood. Commanders roared. Hiders roared, demanding to hold the formation at any cost. The Baron rushed into the thick of it, calling the knights to merciless slaughter. His sword danced, knocking off heads and cutting open the chests of the monsters. The men praised the skill of their lord, breaking a path through flesh. The cavalry trampled the orcs into the mud, turning the field into bloody chaos. The grim victor towered over the corpses, reveling in the swift victory. But joy turned to horror. Giant horned figures emerged from the shadows. The Red Minotaur led the assault, shattering the knights' confidence. A herd of muscular giants surged toward the people like a living mountain. Something deadly whistled through the rainforest. The heavy rumble of footsteps announced the arrival of a new predator. The Blue Minotaur roared, baring its fangs under the blows of the downpour. The beast was on a leash. A mysterious warrior held the monster by the nose ring. General Uru cold-bloodedly watched the slaughter, waiting for his moment. The Minotaurs broke through the defensive lines, sowing animal panic. An apocalypse of muscle and horns crushed soldiers like insects. The Laganzi Mountains became the perfect trap for the Kaitkin army. Uru restrained the beast's fury, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His predatory gaze promised only death and destruction. Scout Koguryo quietly reported on the movement of the surviving enemies. General Kui smirked maliciously, praising the brilliance of his plan. In the throne hall, the strategist revealed the essence of using the geography of the mountains. The emperor studied the features of this hidden trap with interest. The kingdom's law did not apply in these forests due to uncontrollable monsters. The guide vainly tried to explain to the baron the reason for the sudden attack. The advisor explained the detachment was deliberately lured into the beast's lair. The controlled monsters were supposed to become instruments of imperial justice. The strategist finished the report, calculating every detail of the meat grinder. General Baru feared losing valuable slaves for the sake of this game. The advisor's icy gaze made him immediately fall silent. Baru was covered in sweat, realizing the weight of imperial priorities. But there was still one most important nuance left in the strategy. The monarch demanded to know what goal the strategist was really pursuing. Baron Levion had to be kept alive at any cost. The generals did not understand why to spare the enemy's life. Kivi explained, the Baron's death would bring here a real, devastating army. It was better to scare him to death so that he would forget the way to these mountains forever. The emperor praised Kvi, reproaching the elder Baru for narrow-mindedness. Uru began to mock his brother, provoking a new quarrel. The advisor stopped the altercation, reminding about the importance of state affairs. Uru continued to shout, trying to prove his point. The monarch's icy gaze instantly stopped any noise. The giants obediently fell silent, trembling with the anger of their emperor. The emperor wearily ordered Kivi to continue the report. The advisor admitted information about the continent was catastrophically lacking. The plan was audacious: to rescue Baron Levion, disguised as mercenaries, and gain trust to gather intelligence. Gerard was too well known. A secret mission required a new face. Kvi suggested finding someone from the lower ranks who had not yet become known to the enemies. In the rainy forest, young Kvarion heard a contemptuous, "Hey, liar." General Buru appeared from the shadows, radiating rage and strength. The giant intercepted the axe, mocking the audacity of the puppy. The youth panicked, demanding respect before his new subordinates. He pompously declared himself a general, beating his chest with pride. Buru only laughed loudly, looking at these childish ambitions. In his memories, Kvarion bowed before the throne, accepting the monarch's will. The order was a shock. The emperor appointed him general on the spot. Even the experienced Buru widened his eyes at such a sudden promotion. The young man accepted the post, trembling under the heavy gaze of the giant. In memory still echoed Buru's cry, "If you fail, we'll bury you alive." In reality, the general unexpectedly apologized for his own rudeness. He acknowledged the boy's new status, hiding a cunning smile. A massive hand lay on the shoulder. The path ahead promised to be bloody. Kvarion felt unusual warmth and care in the mentor's words. The young man believed that behind Buru's rough shell hid the heart of a true leader. He swore to return with victory, bowing in farewell. The general said dryly, "Take care of yourself." The blue cloak fluttered in the air. Mount set off into the depths of the forest. Buru saw off the squad with his gaze, whispering parting words. But the final general liar instantly shattered all the magic of the moment. The mockery spread through the forest, making the young man shudder with indignation. Kvarion cursed everything in the world, gripping the sword's hilt until it cracked. Buru ominously reminded, "With Goguryeo, jokes end in death." He smiled. This was exactly how true heroes were forged. The squad vanished into the night downpour, heading into the unknown. The plot exploded into battle. The Red Minotaur crushed human bones. A massive club turned the soldier into a bloody mess. The counterattack pierced the blue monster with a forest of steel spears. Baron Levion fought in the very center of hell, gritting his teeth. He ordered the people to escape, preparing to take the blow himself. The magical sword cut the enemy in half, splattering everything with green blood. The remnants of the army fought desperately against the crowd of horned giants. The exhausted knights waited for the final command from their leader. The last order sounded clearly, "Kill the Minotaurs!" Levion was the first to rush into the attack, cutting through the wall of rain. The battle cry of the soldiers momentarily drowned out the roar of the monsters. The turquoise aura of the sword promised a swift death to every Minotaur. The Baron soared into the air, aiming at the giant's head. A lightning flash of energy proved he was a master of the highest-ranked sword. The blade blazed with magic, momentarily dispelling the darkness of the forest thicket. The exhausted squad was breaking through the bushes, gasping heavily for air. The knights reported they had almost escaped the cursed lands of monsters. Levion ordered to make a halt to restore strength before the march. He closed his eyes, trying to calm the wild heartbeat. Vigilance was above all. The squad prepared for a short rest. The warriors formed a protective circle, keeping steel at the ready. The Baron leaned against a tree, mourning every lost soul. Out of 300 fighters, only a handful of shadows remained alive. One of the soldiers cautiously stepped into the darkness of the night forest. Comrades warned, deadly danger still lurked around. The young man hurried to relieve himself, unaware of the ambush. A piercing scream tore through the night. 2 pikes instantly pierced his body. Levion froze in horror, looking into the depths of the thickets. The 2-headed ogre emerged from the shadow, raising a massive club. The monster roared, spitting saliva and magical fury. The Baron did not understand how such a creature ended up in these lands at all. The giant loomed over the people, preparing the final devastating blow.